338 episodes. That is how many installments of South Park have aired since August 13th, 1997, when four foul-mouthed children from a small Colorado town first appeared on Comedy Central and changed the landscape of American animation forever. 338 episodes produced across 28 seasons, each one assembled under conditions that would make most television professionals resign on the spot. 6 days. That is the standard window. From the first pitch on a Thursday morning to the final broadcast the following Wednesday night, every single episode of South Park is conceived, written, voiced, animated, edited, and delivered in roughly 144 hours. And across nearly 3 decades of operating under that kind of pressure, things have gone wrong. Sometimes spectacularly wrong. Episodes have been rewritten overnight because reality itself changed faster than the script could keep up. Episodes have aired with endings their own creators openly despise. Episodes have been banned from streaming platforms and erased from official archives. Episodes have provoked death threats from extremist organizations and diplomatic incidents with foreign governments. Episodes have been built from the spliced together vocal remnants of an actor who was no longer willing or able to participate. And episodes have been begged by their own creator not to air at all, only to become some of the most beloved television ever produced. These are the broken episodes of South Park, the ones where the seams show, the ones where the machinery failed, or was forced to operate under impossible constraints, or simply produced something that nobody involved wanted to take credit for. This is not a ranking. This is not a list of the worst episodes. This is something stranger than that. This is the story of what happens when a show that already operates on the razor edge of impossibility tips over that edge entirely. This is Paper Town, so settle in, get comfortable, let the screen dim if you need it to. This one is going to take a while. There is a moment in the history of South Park that functions almost like a creation myth. Before there were 338 episodes, before there was a billion-dollar franchise, before there was a Broadway musical or a series of streaming specials, or a contract reportedly worth $1.5 billion. There were 2 film students at the University of Colorado with an old 8mm camera and a pile of construction paper. In 1992, Trey Parker and Matt Stone made a short film called The Spirit of Christmas. The process was exactly what it sounds like. They cut shapes out of construction paper. They glued those shapes together. They moved them fractionally, frame by frame, photographing each position with an overhead camera to create the illusion of movement. The short featured crude prototypes of what would eventually become Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny, and the plot involved a fight between Jesus and a murderous Frosty the Snowman. It took months to produce a few minutes of footage. The quality was rough. The humor was juvenile. The animation looked exactly like what it was, which is to say it looked like 2 college students moving pieces of paper around on a table. But there was something in it, some quality of irreverence, some willingness to be ugly and strange and confrontational that caught the attention of people who saw it. And one of those people changed everything. 3 years later, in 1995, a Fox executive named Brian Graden saw the original short and commissioned Parker and Stone to make a second one, which he intended to use as a video Christmas card to send to friends and colleagues in the entertainment industry. This version, sometimes called Jesus versus Santa, to distinguish it from the original, featured more refined versions of the 4 boys and established something closer to the visual language that South Park would eventually adopt. The boys looked recognizable. The town looked like a town. The humor had sharpened from pure provocation into something approaching satire. Graydon sent copies to friends. Those friends made copies for their friends. The tape spread through Hollywood like a virus, becoming one of the first pieces of media to go genuinely viral in the pre-internet sense of the word. Executives passed it around at parties. Assistants duplicated it on office VHS machines. Within months, the short had been seen by thousands of people in the entertainment industry, and the phone calls started coming in. Multiple networks expressed interest. Comedy Central, then a relatively minor cable channel, struggling to establish an identity beyond reruns and stand-up specials, offered a series order, and Parker and Stone faced a problem that would define the show for the rest of its existence. The pilot episode, the very first installment of what would become one of the longest-running animated series in American television history, took 3 months to produce. 3 months of cutting and pasting hundreds of paper cutouts, photographing them frame by frame, syncing them to pre-recorded dialogue. 3 months for 22 minutes of television. Parker and Stone spent those 3 months holed up in a Denver studio, painstakingly creating hundreds of construction paper cutouts, including individual mouth shapes and many characters in several different sizes. Every movement, every gesture, every expression had to be physically constructed and photographed. The process was exhausting, tedious, and completely unsustainable for a weekly television series. And Comedy Central wanted episodes on a weekly basis. The solution was to abandon paper entirely and switch to computer animation that mimicked the look of paper cutouts, using a program called Power Animator and later Maya. The transition was not seamless. The early computer animated episodes still looked rough, still carried the fingerprints of a process that was being invented in real time. But the fundamental tension was established from the very beginning. South Park was born from a process that was impossibly slow, and it survived by becoming impossibly fast. That tension between ambition and constraint, between the desire to create something meaningful and the absolute inability to spend more than a few days doing it, is the engine that drives every broken episode the show has ever produced. The first episode of South Park aired on August 13th, 1997. It was called the pilot episode, and it was, by any reasonable standard, a mess. Not in the way that later episodes would be messy, with their last-minute rewrites and censorship battles and production emergencies. This was a different kind of mess. This was the mess of a show that did not yet know what it was. The animation was crude, even by the standards the show would eventually establish. The timing was off in places. The jokes landed with varying degrees of success. Characters who would later become sharply defined were still blurry, still finding their shapes. Cartman was not yet the sociopathic manipulator he would become. Kyle was not yet the moral center he would evolve into. Stan was not yet the disillusioned everyman the show would need. Kenny was already dying though, which tells you something about which elements of the show were load-bearing from the very beginning. But there was something in it, some quality of anarchic energy and genuine strangeness that resonated with audiences in a way that nobody at Comedy Central had anticipated. The show became the highest rated series in Comedy Central history almost overnight. Merchandise flooded the market. The characters became cultural icons. Catchphrases entered the national vocabulary. And Parker and Stone, who had spent 3 months painstakingly assembling the pilot from construction paper, now had to figure out how to produce episodes at a pace that would have been considered reckless for a show with 10 times their budget and staff. The 6-day production cycle was not a choice. It was a survival mechanism. And it would become both the show's greatest strength and the source of nearly every production disaster in its history. If you want to understand how South Park breaks, you have to understand how it is made. Not in the abstract, not as a general concept, but in the specific, grinding, sleep-deprived detail of the actual process. In 2011, a documentary called 6 Days to Air followed the production of the season 15 premiere, an episode called Human Centipede. The documentary reveals a process that looks less like professional television production and more like a controlled demolition. On a Thursday morning, Parker arrives at the South Park studios in Los Angeles with, at most, a vague idea for that week's episode. Sometimes, not even that. Sometimes, the idea is just a feeling, a sense that something in the culture needs to be addressed. A half-formed joke that might or might not sustain 22 minutes of television. The writing process begins, and it does not stop until the episode is finished. Parker writes alone, mostly. He sits in front of a computer and types, and the pages accumulate, and the story takes shape, and the deadlines press in from every direction. The animators cannot begin their work until they have scenes to animate. The voice actors cannot record until they have dialogue to read. The editors cannot cut until they have footage to cut. Every department is waiting for Parker to finish, and Parker is waiting for an idea that might not come. By Friday, something resembling a script usually exists. By Saturday, the animation pipeline is running. By Sunday, the pace has intensified. By Monday, the entire operation is in crisis mode. By Tuesday, the night before the episode airs, the staff is preparing for what they call the all-nighter. Parker and Stone are still working on the script. The animators are still building scenes. The voice actors are still recording dialogue. The entire episode is assembled in a state of sustained crisis, with every department operating simultaneously and feeding their work into a pipeline that has no room for error. The episode is typically completed sometime after 7 in the morning on Wednesday, the day it airs. Audio and picture lock continue into the afternoon. The supervising producer, Frank C. Agnoni II, then takes the master tape to a nearby uplink facility where it is beamed to Comedy Central in New York. arriving just hours before the episode is broadcast to millions of viewers, every single week, for nearly 3 decades. The documentary captures something else, too. It captures the emotional cost, the toll that this process takes on the people who live inside it. Every Tuesday, Parker has said, Matt and the supervising producer Ann Garofino have to talk him off a cliff. Every show, he has said, he is convinced that this is the one that will end it all. That this episode is so terrible, so unfunny, so broken, that it will destroy the legacy of the entire series. He begs them not to air it. He goes home depressed and unable to sleep. He lies awake, running through the episode in his mind, cataloging its failures, imagining the audience's disappointment, convinced that he has finally, irreversibly, ruined something that took decades to build. And then, the following Thursday, the whole process starts again. Fresh blank page, fresh existential terror, fresh impossible deadline. And now, the episodes themselves. The broken ones. The ones where the 6-day miracle did not quite come together, or where forces outside the production conspired to shatter whatever fragile thing was being built. These episodes span the entire history of the show, from its first explosive season to its most recent, and each one represents a different way for a piece of television to fail. Some failed creatively, some failed logistically, some failed because the world changed around them, and some failed because the people who made them were simply too exhausted, too distracted, or too trapped by their own deadline to find a way to make them work. On April 1st, 1998, South Park was the hottest show in America. Not just the hottest show on Comedy Central, the hottest show period. The first season had concluded 5 weeks earlier with an episode called Cartman's Mom is a Dirty Slut, which ended on a cliffhanger that had become a genuine cultural phenomenon. The identity of Cartman's father was teased but not revealed. The final moments of the episode promised resolution, promised that the answer would come in the season 2 premiere, promised that the wait would be worth it. 5 weeks of anticipation. 5 weeks of fan theories and speculation and genuine cultural excitement about a cartoon on basic cable. Magazines ran articles about who Cartman's father might be. Talk shows discussed it. The question had transcended the show's audience and entered the broader cultural conversation. And then April 1st arrived, April Fool's Day. And instead of the promised resolution, viewers got an episode called Terrence and Phillip in Not Without My Anus. It was an entire episode about the show within a show, Terrence and Phillip. No Stan, no Kyle, no Kenny, no Cartman, no resolution to the cliffhanger. Just 2 Canadian cartoon characters making fart jokes for 22 minutes. The episode was, in its own right, perfectly competent. It had jokes. It had a plot. It had a clear satirical target, parodying the 1991 Sally Field film, Not Without My Daughter. None of that mattered. Viewers were furious. 2,000 angry emails flooded Comedy Central within a single week. 2,000 in 1998, when sending an email still required a degree of intentionality that most people would not bother with for mere annoyance. These were people who were genuinely, viscerally angry. Media outlets reported on the backlash. The story became national news. South Park, which had spent its first season becoming famous for its comedy, was now famous for its audience's rage. The anger was so intense, so immediate, and so sustained that Comedy Central took the unusual step of moving up the air date of the actual resolution episode, Cartman's Mom is Still a Dirty Slut, from its planned May 20th slot to April 22nd, nearly a month earlier than planned. The network was so frightened by the audience response that it restructured its entire broadcast schedule to accommodate the demand. The prank had backfired, or had it, because here's the thing about Terrence and Phillip in Not Without My Anus that makes it a genuinely broken episode rather than simply a bad one. Parker and Stone have cited it as one of their favorite episodes. They loved the joke. They loved the audacity of it. They loved the idea of deliberately antagonizing their own audience at the peak of the show's cultural relevance. They loved the pure, unadulterated gall of promising millions of people an answer to a question they had been obsessing over for 5 weeks, and then giving them fart jokes instead. The episode was broken not because the creators failed to execute their vision, but because their vision was, by design, an act of sabotage against their own show's momentum. The episode carries a 6.1 on IMDb. It remains one of the lowest rated installments in the show's history. Some media outlets reported that fans harbored a grudge against the show for more than 5 years after the episode aired, and its creators would not change a thing about it. That paradox the episode that succeeded at exactly what it was trying to do and was despised precisely because of that success, is the first and perhaps purest example of a South Park episode that is broken by intent. And if you are enjoying this so far, a quick subscribe really does help. It is free, and it means we can keep making these long videos for you. Before moving on, there is something about the Terrence and Philip debacle that reveals a deeper truth about the relationship between South Park and its audience. A relationship that has always been more complicated than it appears. Parker and Stone did not pull the prank because they did not care about their fans. They pulled it because they cared about the show more than they cared about the fans' expectations. And that distinction matters, because it is the same distinction that drives every broken episode in the show's history. The show comes first. The creative impulse comes first. The instinct to do the unexpected thing, the dangerous thing, the thing that might not work, comes first. And the audience's desire for something familiar, something safe, something that delivers what it promised, comes second. This is not arrogance. Or if it is arrogance, it is the productive kind. The kind that allows a show to take risks that most television would never consider. But it is also the kind that produces episodes like Terrence and Philip in Not Without My Anus. Episodes that leave the audience feeling not merely disappointed, but betrayed. The prank established something that would remain true for the next 28 years. South Park does not belong to its audience. It belongs to its creators, and its creators will do with it exactly what they want, whether the audience likes it or not. The resolution of the Cartman's father cliffhanger, when it finally came in the episode Cartman's Mom is Still a Dirty Slut on April 22nd, deserves its own mention in the annals of brokenness. The answer to the question that had consumed the fandom for months was that Cartman's mother was actually his father, because she was a hermaphrodite. This was later retconned in season 14, when it was revealed that the original DNA test results had been tampered with by the Denver Broncos to protect one of their players, and that Cartman's actual father was Jack Tenorman, whom Cartman had unknowingly already killed and fed to his half-brother Scott Tenorman in a chili con carne. The tangled web of retcons and contradictions surrounding Cartman's parentage is itself a kind of structural brokenness, a plot line that was established carelessly, resolved unsatisfactorily, retconned years later, and ultimately folded into one of the show's most celebrated episodes in a way that nobody could have planned, because nobody was planning anything. South Park does not plan. South Park reacts, and sometimes the reactions contradict each other, and the contradictions become the story. The following year, in 1999, South Park produced an episode that was broken for entirely different reasons. Not because of a creative choice, but because of a scheduling collision that left the show's creators physically unable to give the episode the attention it needed. The episode was called Jacovosaurs, and it was the fourth episode of the third season. The premise was a parody of Jar Jar Binks, the widely despised comic relief character from Star Wars, The Phantom Menace, which had been released just 4 weeks before the episode aired on June 16, 1999. Parker and Stone, both lifelong Star Wars fans who had grown up dreaming of the prequel trilogy, felt betrayed by how, in their view, stupid the character was. Their response was to create the Jacovosaurs, a species of creatures designed to be the most irritating characters in television history. The idea was to demonstrate, through deliberate exaggeration, how a single annoying character could drag down an entire piece of entertainment. The meta-commentary was clear. Lucas had Jar Jar. Parker and Stone would create something worse. The problem was not the concept. The problem was the timing. June of 1999 was also the final stretch of post-production on South Park. Bigger, longer, and uncut, the show's feature film. Parker and Stone were simultaneously finishing a movie and producing weekly episodes of the television series, and the film's production had been its own kind of nightmare. The MPAA, the organization responsible for rating films in the United States, returned the movie at least 6 times with an NC-17 rating, a designation that would have effectively prevented it from being shown in most theaters. Each time, Parker and Stone would make minor adjustments, resubmit, and receive the same rating. The battle dragged on for weeks. The original title, South Park: All Hell Breaks Loose, had been rejected by the MPAA because it contained the word hell, an objection that Parker and Stone found so absurd that they responded by renaming it South Park: Bigger, Longer, and Uncut. A title that functions as a far dirtier double entendre than anything the MPAA had objected to. The MPAA, apparently oblivious to the innuendo, approved the new title without comment. The film finally received an R rating just 2 weeks before its release date. On the day Jacovosaurus aired, June 16, 1999, Parker was putting the finishing touches on the film's sound mix. His attention was split between two massive projects, and the episode suffered accordingly. The Jacovosaurs, designed to be annoying, succeeded in that goal so thoroughly that they made the episode itself unwatchable for many viewers. The creatures were loud, they were grating, they moved in that particular way that makes the viewer's jaw tighten, and they did not receive enough of a story to justify their screen time, which meant they outstayed their welcome even faster than the Jar Jar Binks they were parodying. Parker and Stone later acknowledged that they had wanted to make the Jacovosaurs even more irritating than Jar Jar, but felt the finished product still did not reach that goal. Whether that represents a failure or a success is a matter of some philosophical complexity. The irony, however, is precise and painful. Parker and Stone set out to demonstrate how a single irritating character could ruin an entire piece of entertainment, and they proved their point by ruining their own episode with the same mistake. Jacovosaurs is broken because its creators were too exhausted, too distracted, and too deeply embedded in a separate production crisis to give it the care it needed. The concept was sound. The execution was compromised. And the result is an episode that fans and critics routinely cite as one of the worst in the show's history. The year 2000 brought another kind of breakdown. On July 5th, an episode called Chef Goes Nanners aired. It was the 7th episode of Season 4, dealing with a controversy over the South Park town flag, which depicts a group of white figures hanging a black figure. The premise is more nuanced than it initially appears. Chef protests the flag as racist, and the episode ultimately reveals that the children see nothing wrong with the flag because they literally do not notice the race of the figures. The boys are not defending racism. They are oblivious to it. The satire cuts in multiple directions, questioning both the adults who refuse to change a clearly offensive symbol and the possibility that racial innocence, real or performed, might itself be a kind of problem. The episode was based on real debates about the Confederate flag in South Carolina, where similar arguments about heritage and racism were playing out in public life. But the episode's problems had nothing to do with its subject matter. They had to do with the calendar. July 5th meant that production on the episode fell directly over the 4th of July weekend. The normal 6-day cycle, which already left no room for error, was further compressed by the fact that the staff wanted to leave early, wanted to go home, wanted to be with their families, wanted to watch fireworks and eat barbecue, and do all the things that people do on Independence Day when they are not trapped in an animation studio trying to finish a cartoon about racial politics. Co-creator Matt Stone described the finished product as half-baked. The word choice is revealing. Not terrible, not unwatchable, half-baked. An episode that was not given the time to rise, to develop, to become the thing it was supposed to become. The result is an episode that feels incomplete, that reaches for ideas it does not have the time or energy to fully develop, that settles for competence when the show's reputation demands something more. Chef Goes Nanners is not a terrible episode. It has an 8.2 on IMDb, which suggests that audiences were more forgiving than the creators. But it remains, by Stone's own admission, an episode that was not given the care it deserved. And in a show where every episode is already produced under conditions of extreme time pressure, to say that an episode was rushed, even by South Park standards, is to say something quite significant about the degree to which it was compromised. Something else happened in 2000 that would not fully reveal its consequences for another 6 years. The 4th season of South Park included an episode called Pip, which aired on November 29th. It was the 14th episode of the season, and it was unlike anything the show had ever attempted. The episode was a retelling of Charles Dickens' Great Expectations, narrated by Malcolm McDowell in the style of a BBC literary adaptation. It focused entirely on the character of Pip, a British exchange student who had appeared sporadically in previous seasons as a mild, polite boy who was routinely ignored or bullied by the other characters. The key word in that description is entirely. None of the 4 main characters appeared. No Stan, no Kyle, no Kenny, no Cartman, just Pip, navigating a fever dream version of Great Expectations that started as a faithful literary adaptation and gradually devolved into a sci-fi nightmare involving heartbreak-powered robots and Miss Havisham attempting to merge with Estella using an army of robot monkeys. The episode is fascinating as an experiment and a disaster as entertainment. Parker has said simply that everyone, including the creators, hates Pip. The episode proved self-indulgent and failed in terms of both viewer response and ratings. The creative lesson according to Parker and Stone, was clear. While they sometimes want to do an episode that is different in style and presentation from the rest of the series, the story still needs to involve the regular characters. Otherwise, audiences will not engage. The connection between viewer and show is maintained not by the setting or the visual style, or even the quality of the writing, but by the presence of the characters the audience has come to know and care about. Remove those characters entirely, and the audience feels unmoored, like they have tuned into the wrong show. The Pip episode carries a 6.6 on IMDb and represents one of the earliest examples of a pattern that would repeat throughout South Park's history. When the show abandons its central cast entirely, it almost always pays a price. This lesson was apparently not absorbed deeply enough, because the show would make the same mistake again, with similar results, in A Million Little Fibers 6 years later. But the Pip episode was the first warning. And like most first warnings, it was felt, acknowledged, and then partially forgotten. 3 years later, in 2003, Season 7 produced an episode that broke in a different way, not in its concept or its production schedule, but in its ending. The episode was called South Park is Gay, and it satirized the metrosexual trend popularized by the reality show Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, which had premiered on Bravo earlier that year and become a cultural sensation. The premise was sharp. Stan, Cartman, and Kenny adopt feminine clothing and grooming habits, throwing themselves into the metrosexual trend with the mindless enthusiasm that children bring to any fad. Kyle refuses to conform and gets bullied for it, finding himself in the strange position of being the least fashionable kid in school because he insists on dressing like a normal fourth grader. The satire was working. The character dynamics were strong. Kyle's resistance to the trend provided a genuine emotional through line, and the absurdity of elementary school children obsessing over moisturizer and hair product was inherently funny. And then the writers needed an ending, and they could not find one. This is the nightmare scenario of the 6-day production cycle. The premise is good. The first 2 acts are solid. The characters are behaving in ways that are funny and true. And then you reach the 3rd act, and you realize that you have no idea how to resolve the situation you have created. Parker and Stone spent hours trying to improve the script, deleting an initial subplot that was not working, brainstorming alternatives, pacing around the writer's room in the grip of that particular creative despair that comes from knowing that the clock is ticking and the answer is not coming. Executive producer Ann Garofino criticized their best idea as stupid, and she was not wrong. Their best idea was crab people, but the clock was ticking, and the 6-day window does not accommodate creative paralysis. You cannot sit with a problem for a week. You cannot sleep on it and come back fresh. You cannot put the episode on hold and work on something else. The air date is fixed. The slot is reserved. Comedy Central is expecting an episode, so they went with crab people. The metrosexual trend, the episode reveals, is being orchestrated by a race of subterranean crab people who want to weaken human males so they can take over the surface world. The crab people emerge from the ground, singing a song that consists primarily of the words crab people repeated at various pitches. They are defeated. The status quo is restored. The end. Parker described the process with a kind of resigned despair. Crab people became this thing in the writer's room, he said. You just know there is something better, but you cannot think of it. And now, you have just got to go with crab people. The frustration in that statement is palpable. This is a man who knows he is settling, who knows the ending does not work, who knows that the episode deserves something smarter, something that resolves the satire rather than abandoning it in favor of a monster movie gag. But the alternative to crab people was no episode at all, and no episode at all was not an option. The irony is that the crab people, born from creative exhaustion and deadline pressure, became one of the show's most iconic and memorable elements. Fans loved them. They became recurring references. The Crab People song became a meme before memes were called memes. The ending that Parker and Stone viewed as a failure of imagination became, in the audience's estimation, a triumph of absurdist comedy. The episode itself carries an 8.1 on IMDb, a rating that reflects audience affection rather than creator satisfaction. South Park is Gay is broken in the most paradoxical way possible. It is an episode whose creators consider it a failure, precisely because of the element that audiences consider its greatest success. If this is the kind of content you enjoy, subscribing is the best way to make sure we keep going. Before the Scientology crisis of 2005 reshaped the show, there was a quieter kind of brokenness playing out in Season 5, the kind that comes from a show outgrowing one of its own defining features. years. The 5th season of South Park, which aired in 2001, was the last season where Kenny died in every single episode. By this point, the creative burden of inventing new deaths for the same character every week had become genuinely oppressive. Parker and Stone would later describe it as a weight, an obligation that drained creative energy from the rest of the episode. They had killed Kenny with natural disasters, with alien technology, with industrial accidents, with medieval weaponry, with acts of God, and with pure bad luck. They had dropped things on him, blown him up, frozen him, burned him, crushed him, dissolved him, eviscerated him, and launched him into space. The audience expected it. The audience waited for it. The audience counted down to it, and Parker and Stone, trapped inside the mechanism they had created, had to keep delivering. The creative exhaustion produced some of the show's weakest early moments. Deaths that felt perfunctory rather than inventive, included because they had to be included, rather than because anyone thought they were funny. These are small breaks, tiny fractures in individual episodes, rather than catastrophic failures, but they accumulate. When a show forces itself to repeat a formula past the point of creative exhaustion, the formula begins to show its age, and the episodes that depend on it suffer accordingly. There is also the matter of the show's broader continuity during this period, or rather, the lack thereof. South Park in its early seasons did not have continuity in any meaningful sense. Events from one episode rarely carried over to the next. Characters who died would return. Characters who learned lessons would unlearn them. The town itself would be destroyed and rebuilt without comment. This was deliberate. Parker and Stone wanted a show that reset every week. A show where every episode was a fresh start with no obligation to honor what had come before. But the absence of continuity created its own kind of brokenness. Viewers who watched the show in order noticed contradictions. Characters' backgrounds shifted between episodes. Kenny's family had 2 children, then 3. Kyle's family moved to South Park when he was 3 years old, except in later episodes where they had always been there. Cartman's understanding of his own race changed, depending on what the episode required. These are not mistakes in the traditional sense. They are the natural consequence of a show that does not keep records of its own history, that prioritizes the joke over the timeline, that treats every episode as an island. But they read as mistakes. They feel like mistakes. And for viewers who care about narrative consistency, they are a persistent, low-level form of brokenness that permeates the entire show. The year 2005 brought South Park to a crossroads that would determine the trajectory of the show for years to come. And it began with a surgery. On March 9th, 2005, the season 9 premiere aired. It was called Mr. Garrison's Fancy New Vagina, and it depicted Mr. Garrison undergoing sex reassignment surgery. The episode itself was provocative by South Park standards, which is saying something for a show that had already killed Kenny McCormick in dozens of different ways, and sent Satan to live on Earth in the body of Saddam Hussein. But the specific provocation of Mr. Garrison's Fancy New Vagina was visual rather than conceptual. The original cut of the episode included approximately 5 minutes of live-action footage from an actual male-to-female sex reassignment surgical procedure. Real surgery, real footage, intercut with the animated characters of South Park as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Comedy Central refused to air that version. The footage was trimmed to 3 brief 1-second shots. The negotiation between the creators and the network was apparently intense, with Parker pushing to include as much footage as possible and the network pushing back with equal force. The compromise, 3 1-second shots, satisfied no one. Parker felt the episode had been gutted. The network felt it had been too lenient. And the more significant fact is what the episode did to its creator. Parker has said that Mr. Garrison's Fancy New Vagina brought him closer to quitting South Park than any other episode. Not because of the content, not because of the controversy, because of the stress of producing it, fighting with the network over its content, and attempting to navigate the line between provocation and responsibility pushed him to his breaking point. He nearly walked away from the show he had created. He did not quit. But the episode represents the closest the show has ever come to losing its creator entirely, not over money or scheduling or creative differences in the traditional sense, but over the sheer emotional toll of making something that exists in permanent conflict with the institutions that distribute it. 8 months later, on November 16th, 2005, Season 9 produced another episode that would have consequences no one could have fully anticipated. Trapped in the Closet. This is where the broken episodes of South Park stop being stories about production mishaps and deadline pressure and start becoming stories about real-world consequences that reshape human lives. The episode's premise is straightforward by South Park standards. Stan joins the Church of Scientology after recruiters discover he has unusually high thetan levels. He is declared the reincarnation of L. Ron Hubbard, the church's founder. Tom Cruise, told by Stan that his acting is just okay, locks himself in Stan's closet and refuses to come out. The double meaning of coming out of the closet is the episode's central joke, and it is delivered with the kind of blunt provocation that South Park had built its reputation on. The episode also includes an extended sequence explaining the creation mythology of Scientology, including the story of the intergalactic tyrant Xenu, presented with a subtitle that reads, "This is what Scientologists actually believe." But this episode was different. This episode had consequences that extended far beyond the bounds of a television broadcast. The first consequence involved the credits. Normally, the closing credits of a South Park episode list the names of everyone involved in its production. For Trapped in the Closet, every single credit was replaced with the names John Smith and Jane Smith. This was not a joke. This was a deliberate protective measure taken in response to the Church of Scientology's well-documented history of litigation against its critics. The people who made the episode, from the animators to the voice actors to the post-production staff, did not want their real names attached to it because they were genuinely concerned about legal retaliation from one of the most notoriously litigious religious organizations in the world. The second consequence involved Tom Cruise himself. Comedy Central had planned to rebroadcast the episode, as it routinely did with popular installments. The rebroadcast was scheduled and promoted, and then it was canceled. Comedy Central publicly stated that the schedule change was a tribute to Isaac Hayes, who had just announced his departure from the show. But other reports told a different story. According to multiple sources, Cruise had threatened to withdraw from his promotional obligations for Mission: Impossible 3, a Paramount Pictures production, if the episode was rebroadcast. Viacom, which owned both Comedy Central and Paramount Pictures, apparently decided that protecting a major film franchise was more important than rerunning a controversial cartoon. The episode was pulled from the schedule. The third consequence involved Isaac Hayes, the legendary soul musician who had voiced the character of Chef since the show's first episode in 1997. Hayes was a practicing Scientologist. He had been a Scientologist for years, throughout his entire tenure on South Park, and had never previously objected to the show's treatment of religion. South Park had mocked Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Mormonism, and numerous other faiths during Hayes' time on the show, and he had not complained. But Scientology was different. On March 13th, 2006, 4 months after Trapped in the Closet aired, a press release announced that Hayes was leaving South Park, citing the show's intolerance toward religion. But the story, like so much involving Scientology, was more complicated than it appeared. In January 2006, 2 months before the resignation announcement, Hayes had suffered a stroke. The stroke left him unable to speak clearly or make decisions on his own. His son, Isaac Hayes III, stated years later that his father did not quit South Park. Scientology did. According to the younger Hayes, someone else, likely one of his father's assistants, all of whom were Scientologists, wrote the resignation letter and submitted it on Hayes' behalf while he was incapacitated and unable to consent to or even understand what was being done in his name. The man who had given voice to one of South Park's most beloved characters for nearly a decade was removed from the show by people acting without his knowledge or approval, using his name and his illness as cover for their own organizational priorities. Hayes died on August 10th, 2008, at the age of 65, having never returned to the show. The fourth consequence was the episode that followed Hayes' departure. On March 22nd, 2006, Comedy Central aired The Return of Chef, the season 10 premiere. It is one of the most structurally unusual episodes in the show's history, and it is unusual for a reason that borders on the grotesque. Because Hayes was no longer available to provide his voice, and because his departure was the direct result of the Scientology episode, Parker and Stone built Chef's dialogue entirely from audio clips, spliced together from previous episodes. Every line Chef speaks in The Return of Chef is a Frankenstein construction, assembled from fragments of recordings made years earlier in completely different contexts. Words that were originally part of one sentence and sense are extracted and grafted onto another. Inflections that belong to one emotion are forced to serve a different one. The splicing is intentionally poor during the scenes where Chef has been brainwashed by a cult called the Super Adventure Club, an obvious stand-in for Scientology, making him sound disjointed and unnatural, like a man whose words are no longer his own. The splicing becomes intentionally smoother after Chef is briefly freed from the cult's influence, a technical choice that doubles as metaphor. And then Chef dies. He is struck by lightning. He falls off a bridge. He hits rocks on the way down. He is impaled on a branch. A mountain lion attacks him. A grizzly bear attacks him. Someone accidentally shoots him while trying to shoot the animals. The bear and the lion rip his face off and tear his body apart. It is one of the most violent death scenes in the show's history, applied to one of its most beloved characters. And it reads as an act of creative retribution against a religious organization that the creators believed had stolen their friend from them. The violence is excessive by design. It is a statement. It says, "You took our friend, and this is what that looks like." The episode is broken in a way that transcends normal production difficulties. It is broken because the human relationship that made it possible, the friendship and professional partnership between Parker, Stone, and Hayes, was broken first. The episode does not exist because of a creative vision, or a satirical target, or a cultural moment worth commenting on. It exists because someone was taken away, and the people who remained had to deal with the wreckage. The year 2006 was, in many ways, the year South Park broke the most. The Scientology fallout was still reverberating when another controversy erupted around an episode called Bloody Mary, which had actually aired on December 7th, 2005, the eve of the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, a date whose significance was either accidental or provocative, depending on whom you asked. The episode depicted a statue of the Virgin Mary that appears to bleed miraculously, with the show's characteristically crude interpretation of what that bleeding looks like and where on the statue it originates. The Catholic League for Religious and Civil Rights, led by its president, Bill Donahue, condemned the episode and demanded an apology. The organization insisted that the episode be permanently retired and never released on DVD. Joseph A. Califano Jr., a board member of Viacom, Comedy Central's parent company, and a practicing Catholic, called the episode appalling and disgusting and pledged to have it reviewed by Viacom's president and CEO, Tom Freston. When Comedy Central re-aired all of Season 9 on December 28th, 2005, Bloody Mary was conspicuously absent from the broadcast. The episode was eventually restored to the schedule on August 2nd, 2006, and it is currently available to stream on Paramount+. But the incident established a pattern that would intensify dramatically in the years to come. External pressure, applied with sufficient force by organizations with sufficient cultural influence, could make Comedy Central alter its own programming. The network that had built its brand on the promise of uncensored content could, in fact, be censored. The question was no longer whether the network would capitulate to external pressure. The question was how much pressure was required, and who was applying it, and what they were willing to do if the network refused. That pattern reached its first critical inflection point with the two-part episode Cartoon Wars, which aired on April 5th and April 12th, 2006. The episode satirized the Danish cartoon controversy, in which European newspapers had published editorial cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad, provoking widespread protests and violence across the Muslim world. The plot centers on Cartman's attempt to get Family Guy canceled after the show announces plans to depict Muhammad in an upcoming episode. The meta-commentary is layered and deliberate. South Park is making an episode about the controversy surrounding the depiction of Muhammad, while simultaneously attempting to depict Muhammad itself. It is a show about censorship that is being censored. It is a satire of cowardice produced under conditions that require a specific kind of courage. In the original draft, Muhammad appeared on screen. Comedy Central refused. The creators and the network entered into a protracted negotiation that reshaped the episode's production in fundamental ways. The dispute was so time-consuming that Parker and Stone, who had originally planned to open Season 10 with these episodes, were forced to postpone them until later in the season. The single episode became a two-parter, partly because the ongoing negotiations kept extending the production timeline. When Cartoon Wars Part 2 finally aired, Muhammad's image was replaced with a black title card explaining that Comedy Central had refused to broadcast the image. Parker and Stone were furious. Their anger was not abstract. It was specific. They pointed out that South Park had freely mocked Christianity, Judaism, Mormonism, and other religions for years without interference. Jesus appears regularly on the show as a character. Buddha has been depicted using cocaine. Moses has been portrayed as a giant floating dreidel. None of these depictions prompted network censorship. But Muhammad, a single figure from a single religion, was treated as uniquely forbidden. Parker and Stone viewed this as a failure of principle, a capitulation to the implicit threat of violence that rewarded intimidation by demonstrating that it worked. After the episode aired, Harper's Magazine approached the creators about printing their uncensored image of Muhammad in a forthcoming issue. Comedy Central refused to grant permission. The image has never been publicly released, but all of that was prologue. The real crisis came 4 years later. On April 14th, 2010, South Park aired its 200th episode, titled simply 200. The episode was designed as a celebration of the show's history, a victory lap that brought back dozens of previously featured celebrities for a massive storyline involving a class action lawsuit against the town of South Park. Tom Cruise, still stinging from his treatment and trapped in the closet, agrees to drop the lawsuit if the town can arrange a meeting with the Prophet Muhammad, whose supposed power to avoid being mocked Cruise wants for himself. Muhammad appears in the episode disguised inside a bear costume, hidden from the audience's view. A joke about the absurdity of depicting a figure who cannot be depicted by depicting him in a form that obscures the depiction. The meta-commentary was, as always with South Park, operating on multiple levels simultaneously. The episode was provocative by design. Parker and Stone knew exactly what they were doing. They had done it before, in Cartoon Wars, and they were doing it again, deliberately, knowingly, with full awareness of the potential consequences. But what happened next went far beyond anything Parker, Stone, or Comedy Central had imagined. In the week between the airing of 200 and its follow-up, 201, a website belonging to a New York-based organization called Revolution Muslim posted an entry that included what it described as a warning to Parker and Stone. The entry stated that they would probably wind up like Theo van Gogh. Van Gogh was a Dutch filmmaker who had been murdered on a public street in Amsterdam in 2004 by an extremist named Mohamed Bouyeri, who objected to a short film Van Gogh had made about violence against women in certain Islamic societies. Bouyeri shot Van Gogh, stabbed him, and pinned a note to his body with a knife. The reference was unambiguous. The Revolution Muslim posting also included the addresses of Comedy Central's offices in New York and South Park Studios in Los Angeles. The author, a man named Zachary Adam Chesser, later claimed the post was meant as a warning rather than a threat, and that providing the addresses was intended to give people the opportunity to protest. Law enforcement did not find the distinction especially meaningful. Before 201 aired, the New York City Police Department increased security at Comedy Central's headquarters in direct response to the Revolution Muslim posting. Federal authorities assessed that while Revolution Muslim itself was, in their estimation, unlikely to engage in direct violence, the posting could inspire others to act. The concern was not the organization itself. The concern was the lone actor, the individual radicalized by the rhetoric, who might take the implied suggestion literally. Comedy Central made a decision. When 201 aired on April 21st, 2010, it had been modified without Parker and Stone's approval, without their consent, without their knowledge, according to some accounts. Every reference to Muhammad's name was obscured by audio bleeps, but the censorship went far beyond Muhammad. Nearly the entire final 2 minutes of the episode, consisting of 3 consecutive speeches by Kyle, Jesus, and Santa Claus about the moral of the story, were bleeped into incoherence. The speeches were about intimidation, about the power of threats to silence speech, about the importance of refusing to be cowed by violence. The moral of the episode, which was about the censorship of free expression through the threat of force, was itself censored through the threat of force. The irony was so perfect, so complete, so devastatingly on the nose, that it would have been brilliant if it had been intentional. It was not intentional. It was just what happened. Parker responded to the censorship with a gesture that has become legendary in the show's production history. He purchased a plane ticket to South Africa and showed it to a Comedy Central executive, a reference to Dave Chappelle's abrupt departure from his own Comedy Central show in 2005, when Chappelle flew to Durban to escape the pressures of fame and the demands of his contract. Parker's message was clear: push me further, and I will do what Chappelle did. I will leave. Parker never actually went to South Africa, but the gesture communicated something about the depth of his frustration, about the gulf between what he wanted the show to be and what the network was allowing it to become. The uncensored version of 201 has never been officially released. Both 200 and 201 were pulled from streaming services and online platforms. And in a move that retroactively altered the show's own history, an earlier episode called Super Best Friends, which had aired on July 4th, 2001, and featured an uncensored on-screen depiction of Muhammad as a superhero who fights alongside Jesus, Buddha, and other religious figures, was also removed from circulation. The episode had aired without controversy in 2001. Nobody had complained. Nobody had noticed. Nobody had cared. But 9 years later, in the wake of the Revolution Muslim threats, the episode was deemed too dangerous to exist in publicly accessible form. As of 2026, 5 South Park episodes remain permanently banned from Paramount Plus and all other official streaming and broadcast platforms. 3 of them, Super Best Friends, 200, and 201, were banned because of the Muhammad controversy. The Muhammad episodes represent the most dramatic example of South Park breaking against forces entirely outside its creators' control. The show that had spent years testing the limits of what could be said on television finally found the limit. And the limit was enforced not by the network's standards and practices department, not by audience complaints, not by advertiser pressure, but by the threat of real-world violence against real human beings. Quick reminder, if you have not subscribed yet, it really does make a difference. Every subscription matters. The story of the Muhammad episodes does not end with the banning. It continues in a quieter, more insidious way, because the censorship of 200 and 201 did something that no other controversy in the show's history has done. It created a permanent gap in the show's archive. Every other South Park episode, no matter how controversial, no matter how offensive, no matter how poorly received, remains available for viewing. Every Tally episode, every Crab People episode, every dead child, every talking piece of excrement, every crude joke about every religion on Earth. All of it is there. All of it can be rewatched, reassessed, criticized, or celebrated. But the Muhammad episodes exist in a different category. They are the episodes that the show's own distributors have decided you are not allowed to see. They are the redacted pages in the show's own history, and their absence changes the way the surrounding episodes are understood. The satirical arc that runs from Cartoon Wars through 200 and 201 is incomplete without the banned episodes. The story the show was trying to tell about censorship, about cowardice, about the selective application of standards depending on who might threaten violence, is a story that can no longer be told in full, because the institutions that distribute the show have enacted the very censorship the episodes were criticizing. The irony is permanent and inescapable. The show that satirized the suppression of speech has had its own speech suppressed. The episodes that argued against censorship have been censored. And unlike a joke about crab people or a prank involving Terrence and Phillip, this particular piece of brokenness cannot be absorbed into the show's canon. It cannot be turned into a running gag or a self-referential callback. It is just gone. 5 episodes removed from the archive with no indication of when or whether they will ever return. That is a kind of brokenness that goes beyond any individual episode's failures. It is a wound in the show's identity, a place where South Park's foundational commitment to saying anything about anyone at any time was overridden by forces the show could not overcome. There is also the question of what the Muhammad controversy did to the people who made the show. Not just Parker and Stone, who are public figures with the resources and the temperament to weather threats, but the staff, the animators, the editors, the production assistants, the voice actors who did not replace their names with John Smith and Jane Smith in the credits of Trapped in the Closet. The people who show up to the studio every week and pour their labor into a product that, in this case, made them potential targets. The 6 Days to Air documentary shows a team of people who work under extraordinary pressure, but who clearly enjoy their work, who take pride in what they produce, who have built a culture of creative commitment around the impossible deadline. What does it do to that culture when the work you are producing might get you killed? That question has never been publicly answered, because the people it applies to are not public figures. They are the John Smiths and Jane Smiths, whose real names have never been attached to the controversy. But the question is there, underneath the surface of every discussion about the banned episodes, and it represents a kind of human cost that no IMDb rating can capture. There is another kind of breaking, though, a quieter kind, less dramatic, less cinematic, the kind that happens not when external forces intervene, but when the internal creative process simply fails to produce what it was supposed to produce. And no episode illustrates this more vividly than A Million Little Fibers, the 5th episode of Season 10, which aired on April 19th, 2006. The episode focuses on Towley, a talking towel character who had been introduced in Season 5 as a deliberate experiment in how far the show could push the concept of a terrible character. Towley was designed to be bad. He was conceived as a parody of the entertainment industry's tendency to create new characters solely for the purpose of selling merchandise. He was a joke about the cynicism of the creative process. And then, the joke demanded its own episode. In A Million Little Fibers, Towley writes a memoir that is selected by Oprah Winfrey for her book club, only for it to be revealed that the memoir is fabricated. This was a parody of the real-life controversy surrounding James Frey's A Million Little Pieces, a memoir that Oprah had enthusiastically promoted on her show before it was revealed that large portions of the book were fictional. The controversy was enormous. Oprah brought Frey back on her show and publicly confronted him. The incident became a cultural touchstone for discussions about truth, memoir, and the responsibilities of public endorsement. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of cultural moment that South Park was built to satirize. The B-plot involves Oprah's vagina and anus becoming sentient characters who stage a hostage crisis because they feel neglected. None of the 4 main characters appear in the episode. The episode has a 6.1 on IMDb, which some sources identify as the lowest rating in the show's entire history. Parker said it did not turn out well and that he had higher hopes for it. Stone called it weird, on top of weird with weird in the middle, and said he would erase it if he could. The creators themselves, the people who made the episode, who wrote it and directed it and supervised its production, view it as one of their worst. And the reasons are instructive, because they reveal the specific ways in which the 6-day production cycle can produce failure. First, the absence of the main characters. Just as with Pip 6 seasons earlier, the decision to build an entire episode around a secondary character without the grounding presence of Stan, Kyle, Cartman, or Kenny left the episode feeling untethered from the show's emotional core. The audience of South Park does not tune in for Towley. They do not care about Towley's aspirations, or Towley's struggles, or Towley's literary ambitions. They care about the 4 boys. They care about the relationships between the 4 boys. They care about the way the 4 boys interact with the absurd world around them. Remove the boys, and you remove the thing the audience came for. Second, the crude humor involving Oprah's anatomy, which might have worked as a 3-minute B-plot in an episode with a stronger central story, was asked to carry nearly half the episode's runtime. The joke was not strong enough for that burden. It was a sketch comedy bit stretched into a narrative arc, and the stretching exposed its thinness. Third, and most fundamentally, the episode felt like a waste of a good premise. The James Frey parody was timely and had genuine satirical potential. The intersection of celebrity culture, literary fraud, and media accountability was rich territory for the kind of commentary South Park excels at. But the execution buried that potential under layers of absurdity that, for once, did not enhance the comedy, but smothered it. The satirical point was lost in the noise of sentient genitalia and talking towels. The same season produced another episode that broke, but in a completely different direction. Stanley's Cup was the 14th and final episode of Season 10, airing on November 15th, 2006. It is a parody of the Mighty Ducks and the broader genre of inspirational sports movies in which a ragtag team of underdogs overcomes impossible odds to achieve victory. These movies follow a formula so rigid, it barely qualifies as a story. A reluctant coach is assigned to a terrible team. The team struggles. The coach learns to believe in them. The team starts winning. They advance to the big game. They face an opponent who seems unbeatable. They win. Everyone cheers. Credits roll. The formula is designed to produce exactly one emotion, which is the warm satisfaction of seeing effort rewarded and hope vindicated. Stanley's Cup follows this formula faithfully for approximately 19 minutes and then detonates it completely. In the South Park version, Stan is forced to coach a Pee-wee hockey team that includes a young boy named Nelson, who is dying of cancer. Nelson's only wish is to see his team win. The genre conventions promise, with decades of precedent backing them up, that the team will win, that Nelson will be inspired, that the story will end in triumph. Instead, the team is given the chance to play during the third period of an actual NHL game between the Colorado Avalanche and the Detroit Red Wings. The Pee Wee players, who are approximately 4 years old and 3 feet tall, are sent onto the ice against professional hockey players. 20 minutes of savage body checking later, the Pee Wee team has lost 32-2. Shortly afterward, Nelson dies of cancer. The ending provoked a significant backlash. Viewers accused the creators of extreme distaste. Regular fans who were accustomed to the show's provocative humor found this particular ending genuinely upsetting, not because it was offensive in the show's typical way, but because it felt cruel in a different way, a way that lacked the satirical intelligence the audience had come to expect. The fact that Stanley's Cup was chosen as the season finale intensified the frustration. A season finale is supposed to be a send-off, a high note, a reason to come back next year. Stanley's Cup felt like a challenge rather than a gift. Parker and Stone, for their part, were bewildered by the reaction. Parker said that they thought the ending was really sweet and weird, but nobody really got it. The creators saw the episode as a commentary on the manipulativeness of the inspirational sports movie genre, a demonstration of how those movies exploit genuine suffering, in this case, a child's cancer, for cheap emotional catharsis. By refusing to deliver the expected catharsis, by allowing the sick child to die and the team to lose, Parker and Stone believed they were exposing the hollowness of the formula. The audience, however, did not interpret the episode as media criticism. They interpreted it as a story about a sick child whose team loses and who then dies, and they did not enjoy it. The episode carries a 7.4 on IMDb, which is respectable by most standards, but low for South Park, and it remains one of the most polarizing episodes in the show's history. It is broken in the specific sense that the gap between the creator's intent and the audience's reception was wider than usual. Wider than the 6-day production cycle allows anyone to anticipate or correct. Parker and Stone saw dark, absurdist comedy. Many viewers saw cruelty, and the process that produced the episode, a process without test screenings or focus groups, or even a second pair of objective eyes to say, this might not land the way you think it will, had no mechanism for catching the disconnect before it reached millions of living rooms. Season 10 was the most broken season in South Park's history. 5 episodes from that single season, The Return of Chef, Cartoon Wars, Parts 1 and 2, A Million Little Fibers, Stanley's Cup, and Make Love Not Warcraft, represent 5 entirely different categories of breaking. One was broken by the loss of a cast member and the interference of a religious organization. 2 were broken by network censorship and the threat of external violence. 1 was broken by creative misjudgment and the absence of the show's central characters. 1 was broken by the gulf between intention and reception. And 1, Make Love Not Warcraft, was broken only in the mind of its creator, who was convinced it was a catastrophe while the rest of the world recognized it as a masterpiece. No other season in the show's 28-year run has produced that concentration of dysfunction. And all of it was happening while Trey Parker was, by his own account, convinced on a weekly basis that every episode would be the one that destroyed the show. If you are still with this and have not subscribed, now would be a wonderful time. It is completely free, and it keeps this channel alive. There is a particular episode from that era that deserves special attention, not because it broke during production, but because it broke years after it aired, slowly, gradually, the way a foundation cracks under the weight of a shifting landscape. The episode is Man Bear Pig, the 6th episode of Season 10, originally airing on April 26, 2006. In the episode, Al Gore visits South Park to warn everyone about a creature called Man Bear Pig. The creature is an obvious allegory for climate change. Gore is portrayed as an attention-seeking alarmist, a man more interested in being taken seriously than in the validity of his own claims. Man Bear Pig is treated as imaginary, a figment of Gore's need for relevance. The boys in the town ignore Gore's warnings and move on with their lives. The episode ends with the implicit message that Gore is wrong, that the threat is fabricated, and that the real problem is the kind of person who insists on being heard about problems that do not exist. The episode was funny. It was well constructed. The satire was sharp. Gore's mannerisms were captured with the kind of precision that South Park brings to its best celebrity parodies. And in 2006, the episode's stance was not unusual. Climate skepticism was mainstream. The cultural conversation about global warming was still framed, in many quarters, as a debate between two equally valid positions, rather than a scientific consensus being resisted by political and economic interests. South Park was reflecting the culture, which is what South Park does. And then 12 years passed, and the evidence mounted, and the glaciers melted, and the wildfires spread, and the hurricanes intensified, and the scientific consensus solidified into something that could no longer be reasonably disputed by anyone engaging honestly with the data. And the show's position became increasingly untenable. In 2018, South Park did something it almost never does. It apologized. Season 22, episodes 6 and 7, titled Time to Get Cereal and Nobody Got Cereal, brought Man Bear Pig back. This time, the creature is real. It is massive. It is destructive. It is killing people. And the boys, who had dismissed Gore's warnings a decade earlier, are forced to confront the reality of what they had denied. The episodes function as an explicit apology, both to Gore personally and to the audience that had watched South Park dismissively mock climate activism during a period when that activism was desperately needed. The town of South Park signs a deal with Man Bear Pig, essentially agreeing to sacrifice future generations for present comfort. A metaphor so transparent, it barely qualifies as metaphor at all. Gore himself acknowledged the gesture. He called it a hell of a statement and said he appreciated it. Man Bear Pig is broken in a temporal sense. The original episode was not broken when it aired. It was in step with its moment. It reflected the cultural consensus of its time. But time moved on, and the consensus shifted, and the episode remained exactly where it was, frozen in 2006, saying something that 2018 could no longer tolerate. It broke slowly, over years, as reality made its premise untenable. And the fact that Parker and Stone acknowledged this, publicly and within the show itself, in the form of episodes that explicitly reverse the position of the original, speaks to something important about the nature of broken episodes. Sometimes the damage is not visible at the time. Sometimes it only becomes apparent when the world changes around the thing that was made. And sometimes, if you are honest enough and brave enough, you can go back and say, we were wrong. That took something. Not many shows would do it. There is one more episode from the era between the Muhammad crisis and the 2016 election that deserves attention, because it represents a kind of brokenness that is entirely self-inflicted. The episode is called Funny Bot, the second episode of season 15, and it aired on May 4th, 2011. The episode tackles the concept of comedy itself, which is, for a comedy show, roughly the equivalent of a surgeon operating on their own hand. The premise involves the students of South Park Elementary hosting a comedy awards ceremony, at which they declare the Germans the most unfunny people in the world. The Germans, offended, create a comedy robot called FunnyBot that becomes the world's most popular comedian, putting all human comedians out of work. The episode also features Tyler Perry as the winner of the Kathy Griffin Award, with the only person who laughs at Perry's act being Tolkien, who is upset with himself for finding it funny when nobody else does. The meta-commentary is ambitious. The episode is trying to say something about the nature of comedy, about what makes things funny, about the difference between laughter that comes from genuine humor and laughter that comes from recognition or obligation, but the execution is flat. The FunnyBot character is neither funny enough to justify its existence, nor annoying enough to generate the kind of satirical friction that the best South Park characters produce. The second half of the episode becomes repetitive and uninspired, cycling through the same jokes about the robot's dominance without developing them. The episode was seen by approximately 2.59 million viewers, representing a 17% drop from the season premiere, and critics described it as bland and predictable. These are not words that are typically associated with South Park. FunnyBot is broken because it attempted something that the 6-day cycle is particularly ill-suited to handle, which is abstraction. South Park is at its best when it is attacking specific targets, specific people, specific events, specific cultural phenomena. It is at its weakest when it tries to comment on broad, abstract concepts. Comedy itself is too big, too diffuse, too philosophically complex to be adequately addressed in 22 minutes, produced under conditions of creative duress. The episode reaches for profundity and achieves only vagueness, a common fate for South Park episodes that try to be about everything instead of about something. There is also the matter of the show's Imagination Land trilogy, which aired across 3 consecutive weeks in October 2007 as episodes 10, 11, and 12 of season 11. The trilogy is not broken in the traditional sense. It won the 2008 Emmy for Outstanding Animated Program. It is well regarded by fans and critics, but its production history reveals something important about the limits of the 6-day cycle. Imagination Land was originally conceived as a second South Park movie, a theatrical follow-up to Bigger, Longer, and Uncut. The scope of the project was enormous, involving dozens of copyrighted characters from other properties, from Care Bears to Freddy Krueger to Jesus Christ, all inhabiting a shared imaginary realm. But the legal complexities of using so many copyrighted characters in a theatrical release proved prohibitive. The movie was abandoned, and the material was repurposed as a television trilogy. What makes Imagination Land significant in the context of broken episodes is the production timeline. Unlike every other South Park episode, which is produced in 6 days, Imagination Land began production almost 3 months before it premiered. 3 months. For a show that normally operates on a 6-day cycle, 3 months is an eternity. It is an entirely different mode of production, one that allows for planning, revision, and the kind of careful construction that the normal schedule explicitly forbids. And the result was, by most accounts, excellent, which raises an uncomfortable question that neither Parker nor Stone has ever fully addressed. If a 3-month production cycle produces Emmy-winning television, and a 6-day production cycle produces episodes like A Million Little Fibers and Jacovosaurs, what exactly does the 6-day cycle contribute that the longer timeline does not? The answer, presumably, is spontaneity, immediacy, the quality of being made right now, in response to right now. But the Imagination Land trilogy demonstrates that South Park can also excel under a completely different set of conditions, which complicates the narrative that the 6-day cycle is essential to the show's identity. The year 2016 broke South Park in a way that no one could have predicted, because 2016 broke a lot of things. The 20th season had committed to a fully serialized format, abandoning the standalone episode structure that had defined the show for most of its run. The serialization had been building gradually. Season 18 introduced light continuity between episodes, with storylines and consequences carrying over from one week to the next in ways the show had never attempted before. Season 19 leaned harder into ongoing storylines, building a season-long arc around PC Principal and the gentrification of South Park that connected every episode to every other episode. Season 20 went all in. Every episode was a chapter in a single ongoing story. Plot threads accumulated across the season. Characters evolved in ways that would only make sense if viewers watched every installment in order. Member berries, a sentient species of fruit that represent nostalgia and its toxic potential, were introduced as a season-long mystery. An internet troll storyline wove through multiple episodes. The relationship between Gerald Broflovsky and the Danish government became an ongoing saga. The centerpiece of the season was the 2016 presidential election. Parker and Stone, like the overwhelming majority of American media, built their storylines around the assumption that Hillary Clinton would win. This was not an unreasonable assumption. The polling data supported it. The cultural narrative supported it. The entertainment industry, which is the world Parker and Stone inhabit, was almost unanimously convinced of it. An episode was written. It was titled The Very First Gentleman, and it was about Bill Clinton navigating his role as the first male spouse of a president. The animation was completed. The voices were recorded. The episode was essentially finished, ready to air the night after the election. And then, on the evening of November 8th, 2016, Donald Trump won the presidency of the United States. The crew scrambled. They had less than 24 hours to rewrite, reanimate, and revoice an entire 22-minute episode. Less than 24 hours. Even by South Park standards, which are already operating at the extreme edge of production feasibility, this was unprecedented. The normal 6-day cycle was compressed into something closer to 18 hours. The finished product, retitled OGs, aired the following night. It was, under the circumstances, a remarkable achievement of production logistics. The fact that a coherent episode of animated television was produced from scratch in less than a day is a testament to the skill and endurance of the South Park production team, but it was also a band-aid on a wound that could not be patched. The entire season had been built on assumptions about reality that no longer applied. Plot threads that had been seeded in earlier episodes no longer made sense in the context of a Trump presidency. Character arcs that were designed to intersect with a Clinton presidency dangled without resolution. The member berries, whose purpose and origin had been slowly teased throughout the season, never received a satisfying explanation. The serialized format, which was supposed to give the show new narrative depth and ambition, had instead trapped it. The very quality that makes South Park vital, its reactivity, its ability to respond to the world in real time, was working against the serialized structure, which requires planning and foresight, and a stable reality to plan against. A standalone show could have pivoted. A serialized show could not fully, not in the middle of a season that was already more than halfway complete. The remaining episodes lurched from one improvised solution to another, trying to reconcile a pre-Trump narrative with a post-Trump reality, and the seams showed everywhere. The season finale was called The End of Serialization as We Know It. The title was a statement of intent, so explicit it barely requires interpretation. Parker and Stone had learned, through painful and very public experience, that serialization and South Park's 6-day production cycle were fundamentally incompatible. A show that needs to react to the world on a weekly basis cannot also commit to a season-long narrative plan, because the world does not follow a narrative plan. The world does not have a writer's room. The world does not care about your plot threads. Season 21 returned to a predominantly episodic format. The experiment was over, but its effects lingered. The member berries, which had been introduced as one of the season's central mysteries, were never satisfactorily explained. Their origin, their purpose, their connection to the broader narrative, all of these threads were left dangling when the serialized format was abandoned. For fans who had invested in the mystery, who had theorized about what the member berries represented and where the storyline was going, the lack of resolution felt like a betrayal. Not the deliberate, playful betrayal of the Terrence and Philip April Fool's prank, but a genuine failure to deliver on a promise. The show had asked its audience to follow a season-long narrative. The audience had followed, and the narrative had fallen apart, not because of a creative choice, but because reality had made the planned ending impossible and the replacement ending inadequate. The experience also revealed something about the show's audience that had not been visible before. South Park's fans, it turned out, had different expectations, depending on the format. The fans who loved the standalone episodes appreciated the show's unpredictability, its willingness to be different every week, its refusal to commit to any single narrative direction. The fans who loved the serialized seasons appreciated the depth, the character development, the sense that the show was building towards something larger than any individual episode could contain. These two groups of fans wanted fundamentally different things from the same show, and the serialization experiment forced the creators to choose between them. They chose the standalone format, which is to say they chose the format that is compatible with their production process. But the serialized seasons, for all their problems, had demonstrated that South Park could tell longer stories with more emotional resonance than the standalone format typically allows. The choice to return to episodic format was not just a creative decision. It was a concession to the 6-day cycle, an acknowledgement that the production process is more powerful than the creative ambition, that the machine dictates the shape of what it produces. The season that tried to tell one big story instead became a cautionary tale about the limits of what a show built on chaos can reasonably attempt to control. Season 20 was not the worst season of South Park. Some of its individual episodes are quite strong, but as a whole, as a unified narrative, it is the show's most visible structural failure. A 14-episode demonstration of what happens when a process designed for improvisation is forced to serve a plan. There is something almost philosophical about the way South Park breaks. Other shows break because of budget constraints, or creative disagreements, or network interference, or the departure of a key cast member. South Park breaks because of a fundamental tension in its own design. The show is built to be reactive, to respond to the world in nearly real time, to turn a Thursday morning's vague idea into a Wednesday night's broadcast. That reactivity is what makes it vital. It is what allows the show to comment on events that happen days or even hours before before an episode airs. It is what gives the show its sense of immediacy, its feeling that the comedy is happening right now, in the present tense, not in the past tense of a show that was written months ago and is now being broadcast into a world that has already moved on. But that same reactivity means there is no safety net. There is no time to fix a bad ending. There is no time to reshoot a scene that does not work. There is no time to reconsider a creative choice that might age poorly or offend the wrong people or simply fall flat. There is no time for second opinions or test audiences or notes from the network. Every episode is a bet, placed at full stakes with no opportunity to hedge. And every week, the bet either pays off or it does not. And either way, the next bet is placed on Thursday morning. Consider the case of Make Love, Not Warcraft, the 8th episode of Season 10. The episode has a 9.5 on IMDb. It won the Emmy for Outstanding Animated Program. It has been cited by fans and critics alike as one of the greatest episodes of animated television ever produced. Blizzard Entertainment, the company that created World of Warcraft, actually collaborated on the episode, providing a substantial amount of the in-game animation that appears in the finished product. The episode is, by every available measure, a triumph, and Trey Parker wanted to kill it. The night before the episode aired, Parker called Comedy Central and begged them not to broadcast it. He was convinced it was the worst thing the show had ever produced, that it was so terrible it would destroy South Park's legacy, that he had finally, irreversibly, lost his ability to write comedy. He went home depressed. He could not sleep. He told Ann Garofino and Matt Stone that he had lost it, that he could no longer write, that the show was over. His despair was total. His conviction that the episode was a disaster was absolute. He was not performing doubt for dramatic effect. He genuinely, sincerely believed that the episode about to air would end everything he had spent a decade building. The episode aired anyway, and it became a cultural phenomenon. This is what the 6-day cycle does to the creative mind. It compresses the entire arc of artistic doubt, from initial excitement, through grinding work, through exhaustion, through despair, through resignation, into less than a week. There is no perspective. There is no distance. There is no moment of clarity where you step back from the canvas and see the painting whole. There is only the work and the clock and the gnawing certainty that this time, finally, the whole thing has fallen apart. Parker has said that this happens every single week. Every show, he says. He tells Matt and Ann that they need to call Comedy Central and tell them there is no show this week. And every week they talk him down. And every week the episode airs. And most weeks, it is fine. And some weeks, it is brilliant. And some weeks, it is genuinely broken. But the process does not distinguish between those outcomes. The process is the same regardless. The anxiety is the same. The despair is the same. The sleepless Tuesday nights are the same. The only variable is whether the finished product happens to be good. And that variable is something that nobody, not even the person who wrote it, can reliably predict from inside the process. This brings us to the question of Kenny. Kenneth McCormick, the 4th member of South Park's Central Group, the boy in the orange parka, whose speech is perpetually muffled by the hood drawn tightly around his face, who dies in nearly every episode of the show's early seasons, only to return the following week with no explanation, no acknowledgement, no apparent memory of having been dead. Kenny is, in a structural sense, the show's original broken element. His existence defies the basic logic of narrative continuity. He dies. He comes back. No one remembers. Or sometimes they remember. Or sometimes he is reborn through his mother overnight because of a curse related to the cult of Cthulhu, as explained in the season 13 episode, Coon vs. Coon and Friends. The rules governing Kenny's mortality are not consistent because they were never meant to be consistent. They were a running gag, a recurring bit of dark humor that gave the show a signature catchphrase and a predictable shock that audiences could look forward to each week. But running gags, if they run long enough, become structural elements. And structural elements need rules. And rules that change every week are not rules at all. By the end of season 5, Parker and Stone were tired of it. They had run out of original ways to kill Kenny. The gag that had defined the show's early seasons had become a creative obligation rather than a source of comedy. Every week, they had to find a new way to murder a child. And every week, the death had to be violent and funny and sufficiently distinct from the previous week's death to justify its existence. The burden of invention was enormous, and the returns were diminishing. So in the 13th episode of season 5, An episode called Kenny Dies, They Killed Him Permanently, not with a falling object or an explosion or some other cartoonish demise, with muscular dystrophy, a real disease, a slow, painful death that was played not for laughs, but for genuine emotion. Cartman cries. Stan struggles to visit his dying friend. Kyle is paralyzed by grief. The episode is, by South Park standards, genuinely moving, and it was designed to be moving, because the permanence of the death required an emotional weight that the weekly gag deaths had never carried. Parker and Stone had originally planned to kill Kyle, but decided Kenny's death would be more impactful precisely because the audience had become desensitized to it. Killing Kenny for real, after killing him as a joke hundreds of times, forced the audience to reckon with the gap between comedy and loss. The permanent death was supposed to open up new creative possibilities. Instead, it created a problem. Season 6 proceeded without Kenny, and fans were upset by his absence. The dynamic among the remaining 3 boys felt incomplete, like a table missing a leg. A character named Butters Stotch was elevated to fill the gap, serving as the 4th friend in Kenny's absence. Butters had appeared in previous seasons as a minor character, a sweet, naive, endlessly victimized boy who served as a contrast to the other children's cynicism. While Butters would eventually become one of the show's most beloved characters, at the time, his promotion felt forced, like the show was trying to fill a space that was shaped specifically for someone else. Kenny returned in the season 6 finale, Red Sleigh Down. The running death gag resumed, though at a greatly reduced frequency. No more weekly deaths. No more obligatory dismemberments. Kenny now dies occasionally, perhaps once or twice a season, and the deaths carry slightly more weight because they are no longer expected. The show had tried to fix a broken element by removing it entirely, only to discover that the broken element was load-bearing. Kenny's inconsistent mortality, his impossible resurrections, his cheerful defiance of narrative logic was not a flaw in the show's structure. It was the structure, or at least a critical part of it. And there is one more aspect of Kenny's brokenness that deserves attention. In the episode Best Friends Forever, which aired in season 9, Kenny is revealed to have a younger sister named Karen. This was a problem because previous episodes had established that the McCormick family had only 2 children, Kenny and his older brother Kevin. Matt Stone admitted that Karen was an oversight, a continuity error introduced because the 6-day production cycle does not leave time for comprehensive fact-checking against the show's own history. Nobody checked. Nobody caught it. Karen was written into the episode aired, and the error became part of the permanent record. Karen did not appear again for years. When she finally returned in the episode The Poor Kid, her existence had been quietly absorbed into the show's canon. The error had been transformed into established fact through sheer repetition. Nobody acknowledged the contradiction. Nobody explained it. Nobody apologized for it. Karen McCormick simply existed, as though she had always existed, and the previous episodes that contradicted her existence were silently overwritten by the new reality. This is how South Park handles its own brokenness. It does not fix mistakes. It incorporates them. The mistake becomes part of the show. The error becomes canon. The broken thing is declared to have always been that way. This is a good moment to mention that if you have not subscribed yet, it would mean a lot. Every subscription helps, and it is the easiest way to support what we do here. The question of what happens when South Park removes a character and what happens when it adds one deserves deeper examination, because both processes have produced their own forms of brokenness. The Kenny situation, which has already been discussed, is the most dramatic example of removal. But the show's history is littered with characters who were added, elevated, transformed, or discarded in ways that created narrative and tonal inconsistencies. Consider Butters Stotch, who was promoted from background character to main cast member in the wake of Kenny's temporary death. Butters is, by any measure, one of South Park's great characters. His innocence, his vulnerability, his inability to understand the cruelty of the world around him provides a counterpoint to Cartman's sociopathy that the show desperately needed. His catchphrase, his trusting nature, his willingness to go along with schemes that any reasonable person would recognize as disastrous, all of these qualities have produced some of the show's best episodes. But his elevation was also a source of disruption. The dynamic between Stan, Kyle, Kenny, and Cartman was a 4-part chemistry that had been calibrated over 5 seasons. Replacing one element of that chemistry, even temporarily, changed the way every other element interacted. Stan without Kenny was different. Kyle without Kenny was different. And Cartman without Kenny was fundamentally different, because Kenny's silence and passivity had always served as a kind of counterweight to Cartman's loudness and aggression. With Kenny gone, Cartman had no one to dominate. no one to casually mistreat without resistance, and the dynamic shifted in ways that took time to recalibrate. Then there is the case of characters who were added not to replace someone, but to serve a thematic purpose. PC Principal, introduced in the season 19 premiere Stunning and Brave, was designed as a satirical vehicle for the show's commentary on political correctness and cancel culture. The character was effective in that role, providing a source of institutional authority that the boys could push against. But PC Principal also introduced a structural problem. He was too powerful. As a principal, he had authority over the boys that previous antagonists lacked. He could punish them. He could silence them. He could impose consequences that the show's previous authority figures, from Principal Victoria to Mr. Mackey, had never been capable of imposing. And this created a constraint on the show's storytelling. The boys, who had always operated as free agents in a world that largely ignored or failed to control them, now had to navigate a figure who could and would shut them down. Season 19 handled this well. The tension between the boys and PC Principal drove the entire season's arc. But Season 20, which kept PC Principal as a significant character while also attempting a fully serialized format, struggled to find a role for him, and his presence contributed to the season's sense of narrative confusion. The show's handling of Mr. Garrison's transformation into a Trump surrogate during seasons 19 and 20 represents another form of character-driven brokenness. Mr. Garrison, who had been an eccentric but relatively stable presence in the show for years, was rewritten as a political figure running for president on a platform of vulgarity and xenophobia. The parallel to Donald Trump was explicit and intentional, but the decision to merge a fictional character with a real political figure created problems that the show could not easily solve. When Trump won the 2016 election, Mr. Garrison became the president of the United States in the show. This was not a creative choice made in a writer's room. This was a reactive adaptation to a reality that the show had not anticipated, and it trapped the character in a role that was defined not by his own internal logic, but by the behavior of a real person over whom the show had no control. Mr. Garrison as president was funny when Trump did funny things. Mr. Garrison as president was uncomfortable when Trump did uncomfortable things. And the show's writers, bound by the parallel they had created, could not easily separate the character from the real-world figure without abandoning a storyline that had consumed 2 full seasons. There is a specific kind of brokenness that belongs to the episodes South Park produced in the immediate aftermath of national trauma. And perhaps no episode better illustrates this than the one that aired on November 7th, 2001, less than 2 months after the September 11th attacks. The episode was called Osama bin Laden Has Farty Pants, the 9th episode of Season 5. It was the first South Park episode to premiere after the attacks, and it carried the weight of that fact in every frame. The episode dealt with the aftermath of the attacks and the American invasion of Afghanistan, sending the boys to Afghanistan through a series of improbable events. They are accidentally shipped overseas in a crate. They end up in an Afghan village. They confront Osama bin Laden in a sequence that parodies old Warner Brothers cartoons, with Cartman playing Bugs Bunny to bin Laden's Elmer Fudd. The slapstick is deliberate and exaggerated, a conscious echo of the propaganda cartoons that Hollywood produced during World War II, when the enemy was rendered absurd as an act of patriotic defiance. The episode was produced under the same 6-day cycle as every other episode, but the context was different. The country was grieving. The wounds were fresh. The rubble at Ground Zero was still smoldering. The question of whether comedy was appropriate, whether anything was appropriate other than solemnity and rage, was being debated across every platform of American culture. Late-night talk shows had gone dark for a week after the attacks. Saturday Night Live had opened its first post-9/11 episode with a somber address from Mayor Giuliani. The entire entertainment industry was struggling with the question of how or whether to return to normal, and South Park, by virtue of its production schedule, had to answer that question faster than almost anyone else. The show could not take a break. The show could not go on hiatus while the culture figured out what was appropriate. The production cycle kept running, the deadline kept approaching, and the blank page still needed to be filled with 22 minutes of content. The episode that resulted was not bad. It was not great. It was competent and occasionally funny, and unmistakably a product of its moment. The humor is broad and sometimes uncomfortable, not because it crosses a line that should not be crossed, but because it exists so close to a wound that is still open. The episode is broken in the sense that any creative work produced under the shadow of catastrophe is broken. It cannot fully address the thing it is responding to because the thing is still happening. It cannot achieve the perspective that comes with distance because there has been no distance. It can only exist, imperfectly, as a document of a moment when a show that is required by its own nature to comment on everything was confronted with something that resisted commentary. And then there is the episode that broke, not because of what it said, but because of what it meant for a billion people who would never get to see any episode of South Park again. On October 2nd, 2019, South Park aired Banned in China, the second episode of season 23. The episode attacks the American entertainment industry's willingness to self-censor in order to access the Chinese market. The premise is built on a real and well-documented phenomenon. Hollywood studios routinely alter their films to satisfy Chinese censors, removing references to Taiwan, Tibet, and other politically sensitive subjects in exchange for access to the world's second largest film market. The practice is widely known within the industry and rarely discussed publicly. South Park discussed it publicly. One storyline follows Randy Marsh getting arrested while trying to sell marijuana in China and being sent to a labor camp that resembles the detention facilities China has used in Xinjiang province to hold Uyghur Muslims. Another follows the boys band being told that certain aspects of their lives will need to be edited out of a biopic to make it marketable in China. The episode also features Disney characters visiting the labor camp, a reference to Disney's well-known willingness to accommodate Chinese censorship demands. The episode is direct, specific, and unsparing. It names names. It draws connections. It says the things that most of the entertainment industry has agreed, through a combination of financial incentive and political caution, not to say. And the Chinese government responded exactly as the episode predicted it would. Within days of the episode's broadcast, South Park was scrubbed from the Chinese internet. Every clip, every episode, every mention of the show was removed from Chinese streaming services, social media platforms, and fan forums. South Park was effectively erased from one of the largest media markets in the world, a market that represents over 1 billion potential viewers. The ban was total. The erasure was complete. Parker and Stone issued a response that was, characteristically, a mock apology. Like the NBA, they wrote, "We welcome Chinese censors into our homes and into our hearts." The statement was a reference to the NBA's own controversy with China, which had erupted the same week when Daryl Morey, then general manager of the Houston Rockets, tweeted his support for Hong Kong protesters, prompting a furious response from Beijing and a scramble by the NBA to contain the diplomatic fallout. Banned in China is broken in a geopolitical sense. It is an episode that functions perfectly as television. The writing is sharp. The satire is on target. The comedy works, but the episode's very success rendered the entire show inaccessible to over 1 billion people. Whether that constitutes a production disaster or a creative triumph depends entirely on your perspective. Parker and Stone would almost certainly call it the latter. But the fact remains that an episode of a cartoon comedy show, produced in 6 days in a studio in Los Angeles, provoked an international incident and resulted in the complete removal of the show from one of the world's largest countries. That is a kind of breaking that most television shows cannot even conceptualize, let alone experience. And then there are the episodes that are broken by the passage of time itself. The early seasons of South Park, particularly seasons 1 through 3, occupy a strange position in the show's history. They are the episodes that made the show famous. They established its characters, its tone, its willingness to transgress every boundary that polite society had erected. Cartman's casual cruelty, Kenny's weekly demise, Chef's sexual confidence, the show's gleeful willingness to say, in a children's cartoon, the things that nobody was supposed to say. These episodes were a cultural event. They changed what was possible on television. They made Comedy Central a viable network. And Trey Parker cannot stand them. He has said publicly that the early seasons make him feel embarrassed. He views them as crude, both in their animation and their writing, as the work of someone who did not yet know what he was doing. The voices are not quite right. The pacing is uneven. The satire is blunter than it would later become, swinging at targets with a club rather than a scalpel. Parker sees the early seasons the way most people see their own adolescent writing, with a mixture of recognition and discomfort, knowing that the person who made those things and the person who is now judging them are the same person, separated only by time and experience. This is a common sentiment among creators of long-running shows, but it takes on a particular intensity with South Park because of the way the show is made. There are no rewrites. There are no second drafts. There is no development process that catches the weak jokes before they air and replaces them with stronger ones. The version of the episode that airs is, almost always, the only version that exists. There is no director's cut, no revised edition, no special edition with updated effects and re-recorded dialogue. When the early seasons were remastered to high definition, some alterations were made. In the pilot episode, the computer animated segments were updated to better match the rest of the episode. Some construction paper shots were reanimated digitally, possibly because the original frames had been lost. But these are cosmetic changes. The scripts, the jokes, the structural choices that Parker finds embarrassing remain exactly as they were in 1997, preserved in amber, permanent and unalterable. Now consider what it means to feel embarrassed by your own work when that work has been seen by hundreds of millions of people and is available permanently on streaming platforms around the world. You cannot take it back. You cannot revise it. You cannot issue a corrected edition. The episodes exist exactly as they were made, and they will continue to exist for as long as the show's archive is maintained. The broken elements of those early episodes, the clunky jokes, the unrefined voices, the animation that looks like it was assembled in a garage, because it essentially was, are preserved forever. A permanent reminder that the show's most famous season was also, in its creator's estimation, the one he would most like to forget. There is one more category of brokenness that deserves examination before we move to the show's more recent history, and it is perhaps the most fundamental kind of all. It is the brokenness that comes from the show's relationship with its own past. South Park has been on the air long enough that it has accumulated a vast mythology, a dense web of character histories, running jokes, established relationships, and world-building details that span nearly 3 decades. And the show has never maintained a Bible. There is no document that catalogs what has happened to each character, what has been established about their families or their histories or their preferences. There is no continuity editor who reads each new script and flags contradictions with previous episodes. The 6-day cycle does not allow for that kind of institutional memory. Each episode is written in the moment, drawing on whatever Parker remembers about the show's history, supplemented by whatever the writer's room can recall on the fly. And the result is a show whose own history is riddled with contradictions, retcons, and outright impossibilities. Kyle's family background is a case in point. Several early episodes mention that the Broflovskis moved to South Park when Kyle was about 3 years old. But in the season 14 episode, it's a Jersey thing. It is a plot point that they moved to South Park while Kyle's mother Sheila was still pregnant with him, meaning Kyle was born in South Park rather than moving there as a toddler. These two facts cannot both be true, but both of them are established in the show's text, and neither has been officially acknowledged as an error or retconned away. They simply coexist. Two incompatible claims about the same character, both equally canon, each quietly ignoring the other's existence. Cartman's racial identity has similarly drifted over the course of the series. In some episodes, he identifies as white. In others, he claims to be part of various ethnic groups when it serves his purposes. His weight has been a consistent character trait, but the degree to which other characters acknowledge it and the ways in which it affects his life have varied dramatically between episodes. These inconsistencies are not the result of deliberate creative choices. They are the result of a production process that prioritizes the needs of the current episode over fidelity to the show's established history. And for a show that was originally designed to reset every week, this was not a problem. But as South Park has increasingly incorporated continuity, particularly from season 18 onward, the accumulated contradictions have become harder to ignore. A show that asks its audience to follow ongoing storylines also implicitly asks its audience to trust that the storylines are built on a consistent foundation. And that foundation, in South Park's case, is made of sand. The COVID-19 pandemic broke South Park in yet another way by disrupting the very production process that defined the show. When the pandemic hit the United States in March 2020, South Park Studios closed. The crew that had spent over 2 decades producing episodes in the same building, using the same frantic 6-day process, was suddenly unable to gather. The production model that had survived every previous crisis, from 9/11 to election night scrambles to death threats from extremist organizations, could not survive a virus that made it dangerous for people to be in the same room. The solution was to abandon the regular season format entirely and produce longer-form specials. The pandemic special aired on September 30th, 2020, as the first episode of a truncated 24th season. It was followed by the South Park U vaccination special on March 10th, 2021. The specials were produced remotely, with the crew working from home using the show's digital production tools. The process was different. The energy was different. The collaborative chaos of the studio, the all-nighters, the frantic passing of files between departments, the physical proximity of the people who make the show was replaced by video calls and file transfers, and the particular loneliness of creative work done in isolation. The specials were well received, but they represented something unprecedented in the show's history. For the first time in over 20 years, South Park did not produce a regular season. The 6-day cycle, which had survived everything, was suspended. The show adapted, as it always does, finding a way to continue producing content under conditions that should have made production impossible. But the adaptation came at a cost. The regular rhythm of the show was disrupted. The weekly appointment, the sense that South Park was always there, always commenting, always reacting, was lost. The pandemic specials were good television, but they were not South Park in the way that the weekly episodes are South Park. They were something else, something slower and more deliberate, produced under conditions that allowed for the kind of reflection and revision that the 6-day cycle explicitly forbids. And then there is the matter of the deal. In August 2021, Parker and Stone signed a contract with Paramount, reportedly worth $935 million. The deal included new seasons of the television series and 14 streaming specials for Paramount Plus, 2 per year. In 2025, the deal was renegotiated and expanded, with reports placing the total value at approximately $1.5 billion over 5 years. These are staggering numbers. They represent a financial commitment to a single animated television show that has no precedent in the history of the medium. And they carry their own kind of pressure, a different kind of pressure from the 6-day cycle, but no less intense. The deal commits Parker and Stone to producing content at a pace and volume that even they might struggle to sustain. Multiple specials per year, plus regular seasons, plus the ongoing obligation to make every episode feel vital and relevant and worthy of a franchise that is now valued in the billions. The question that hangs over the show's future is whether that pressure will produce more broken episodes or fewer. On one hand, the financial security of the deal might alleviate some of the existential anxiety that has always been part of the production process. Parker and Stone are no longer fighting for their show's survival. They no longer need to worry about cancellation or contract negotiations, or the possibility that the network will lose patience with their controversies. On the other hand, the obligation to produce a specific volume of content, year after year, for the duration of a multi-billion-dollar contract, carries its own form of creative pressure. The 6-day cycle has always been sustained by a combination of desperation and inspiration. What happens when the desperation is removed, but the pace remains? The pandemic also produced something unexpected, which was a demonstration that South Park could exist in a completely different format and still function as South Park. The post-COVID special, which premiered on Paramount Plus on November 25th, 2021, was a feature-length production that imagined the South Park characters as adults in a world shaped by decades of pandemic aftermath. It was produced with something approaching a normal production timeline, without the 6-day crisis that defines the regular show. And it was good. Not in the way that a regular South Park episode is good, with its sharp topicality and its sense of breathless immediacy, but in a different way. A way that suggested the show's characters and themes could sustain a more deliberate, more carefully constructed form of storytelling. The question of what this means for the show's future, whether the specials represent an evolution or a divergence, remains unanswered. Season 27, which aired in 2025, may have provided a partial answer. The season was notable for being, at just 5 episodes, the shortest season in the show's history. The abrupt ending, announced only after those 5 episodes had already aired, retroactively transformed what viewers thought was a mid-season episode into a season finale. The truncated season raised questions about the show's future trajectory and whether the massive Paramount deal was changing the fundamental nature of what South Park is. The season also sparked controversy through its depiction of political figures, including an episode that portrayed then-President Donald Trump in bed with Satan, a choice that drew criticism from conservative media figures. Another episode, titled Got a Nut, parodied Charlie Kirk and Kristi Noem, Kirk publicly called his parody a badge of honor. But following Kirk's assassination on September 10th, 2025, the episode was pulled from reruns, though it remained available on streaming platforms. The incident was yet another example of reality intruding on the show's fiction in ways that could not have been anticipated, of the world refusing to hold still long enough for a 22-minute cartoon to process it safely. The animation itself has been a source of a different kind of brokenness throughout the show's history, one that is less dramatic than censorship battles or death threats, but no less persistent. South Park's visual style, which mimics the look of construction paper cutouts through digital animation, has evolved significantly over 28 seasons. The changes are gradual when viewed season by season, but dramatic when viewed across the show's full run. Early episodes feature rough edges, simple backgrounds, and limited character movement. Later episodes feature smooth lines, detailed environments, and fluid animation that bears little resemblance to the show's paper-cut origins. Fans have debated whether these changes represent an improvement or a loss. Some viewers appreciate the increased visual sophistication. Others feel that the polished look of recent seasons contradicts the show's punk aesthetic, that the roughness of the early episodes was part of their appeal, that a show made from construction paper should look like it was made from construction paper, even if the construction paper is digital. There have also been specific animation errors that fans have caught over the years. In classroom scenes, characters have changed position between cuts without enough time to have moved. Costumes have changed color mid-scene, with the trimming on a hat shifting from yellow to light brown between shots. Background characters have appeared in multiple locations simultaneously, or disappeared from scenes where they should logically still be present. These are small errors, the kind that exist in every animated show, but they are particularly noticeable in South Park because of the show's visual simplicity. In a show with detailed, naturalistic animation, a minor inconsistency can be hidden by the complexity of the image. In a show where the characters are flat shapes with dot eyes, every inconsistency stands out. The visual simplicity that gives South Park its distinctive look also makes its mistakes more visible, which means the 6-day production cycle, which leaves minimal time for quality control, produces errors that are impossible to miss. When the early seasons were remastered to high definition in the 2000s, the process itself introduced new errors. Some shots that were originally animated on paper were recreated digitally, but the recreation did not always match the original perfectly. Colors shifted, proportions changed. The texture of the animation, which in the early episodes carried traces of the physical materials from which it was constructed, was smoothed out in the HD versions, losing something of the original character in the process. The remastering was, in its own way, a form of brokenness, an attempt to fix something that introduced new imperfections of its own. There is a thread that connects all of these broken episodes, from the first season to the most recent, and it is worth pulling on before this is over. South Park operates in a space between control and chaos. The 6-day production cycle is a deliberate choice, maintained for decades, despite the availability of longer lead times, because Parker and Stone believe that the pressure is what makes the show vital. They have said repeatedly that if they had more time, the episodes would not be better. They would be more polished, perhaps, more technically refined, more carefully constructed, but they would lose the quality that makes South Park feel alive. The sense that the show is being created in real time, responding to the world as it happens, taking risks because there is no time to calculate the consequences. The roughness is a feature, not a bug. The imperfections are evidence of life. The broken episodes are the cost of that approach. They are what happens when the controlled demolition goes slightly wrong, when the explosion that is supposed to bring down the building also takes out the windows of the building next door. Every production disaster, every botched ending, every episode pulled from streaming or banned from an entire country is a consequence of the same fundamental choice. Make the show fast, make it reactive, make it dangerous, and accept that some of the time it will blow up in your face. Other shows avoid these disasters by building in safety margins, longer production cycles, multiple rounds of revision, test screenings, standards and practices, reviews conducted weeks or months before air dates, writers' rooms that operate for months before a single frame of animation is produced. South Park has none of that. South Park has Trey Parker in a room on Tuesday night, convinced that the episode is a catastrophe, being talked off a cliff by the same people who talked him off a cliff the week before and will talk him off a cliff the week after. And the thing is, he is not always wrong. Sometimes the episode is a catastrophe. Sometimes the ending does not work. Sometimes the joke does not land. Sometimes the premise ages so badly that the show has to air an apology 12 years later. But sometimes the episode that Parker is certain will destroy the show turns out to be Make Love, Not Warcraft. Sometimes the ending that the creators view as a creative failure becomes the most iconic moment of the entire season. Sometimes the April Fool's prank that generates 2,000 angry emails becomes a beloved piece of television history. The broken episodes are inseparable from the great ones. They are produced by the same process, under the same conditions, by the same people. The only difference is the outcome. And the outcome, in the 6-day window, is something that nobody can fully control. The show's relationship with its own characters has also been a source of what might be called slow-motion brokenness. Characters who were introduced as one thing gradually became another, and the transformation was not always planned or consistent. Randy Marsh, who began the series as a geologist and a relatively minor presence in the boys' lives, gradually evolved into one of the show's central characters, absorbing more and more screen time as the seasons progressed. By the time the show reached its 20th season, Randy had become, in many ways, the show's protagonist, with the boys increasingly relegated to supporting roles in their own show. This shift was organic rather than deliberate, driven by Parker's growing interest in adult characters and adult problems, but it created a tension within the show's identity. South Park was conceived as a show about 4 children navigating an absurd adult world. When the adults, and Randy in particular, became the focus, the show lost some of the innocence and wonder that had defined its early seasons. The children's perspective, which had always been the show's secret weapon, its way of making the audience see familiar things through unfamiliar eyes, was diluted by the increasing prominence of characters who see the world through exactly the same jaded eyes as the audience. This character drift has been particularly pronounced in the case of Mr. Garrison, whose trajectory over the show's run reads like a medical chart drawn by a seismograph. Mr. Garrison began the series as an eccentric elementary school teacher with a puppet named Mr. Hat. He was closeted, then openly gay, then underwent sex reassignment surgery and became Mrs. Garrison, then transitioned back to Mr. Garrison, then was reimagined as a Donald Trump surrogate running for president, then became president, then was gradually returned to his original role as a teacher. Each of these transformations served the needs of the specific season or episode in which it occurred. But taken as a whole, the character's trajectory is incoherent. There is no version of Mr. Garrison that is consistent across all 28 seasons, because each season requires a different version. The character is not a character in the traditional sense. He is a vehicle, a shape-shifting container for whatever satirical point the show needs to make in any given week. And while that flexibility is a creative strength in the short term, it is a form of structural brokenness in the long term, because it means that Mr. Garrison, one of the show's most prominent characters, does not have a stable identity. He is whoever the 6-day cycle needs him to be. The same could be said, to varying degrees, of almost every recurring character on the show. Chef was a mentor figure until Scientology made him a casualty. Butters was a background extra until Kenny's death made him a co-lead. PC Principal was a villain until the show decided he was a hero. These transformations are not failures of character development. They are features of a production process that does not plan ahead, that responds to the moment rather than serving a grand design. But they create a show that, when viewed across its full run, looks less like a coherent narrative and more like a series of snapshots, each one internally consistent but collectively contradictory. South Park is not a show that builds characters. It is a show that uses characters. And the difference between building and using is one of the many small cracks in the show's foundation that, taken individually, are barely visible, but, taken together, define the shape of the structure. There is a particular episode from 2008 that illustrates this point through the most unexpected of production challenges. The pandemic two-parter, episodes 10 and 11 of season 12, required the use of live-action guinea pig footage. The concept was a parody of found footage horror films and disaster movies, with giant guinea pigs attacking cities around the world. The joke required real guinea pigs, in costume, filmed and composited into the animated scenes. Parker and Stone did not want stock footage. They did not want computer-generated guinea pigs. They wanted real animals, in real tiny outfits, creating real tiny chaos. But the execution revealed a problem that no one had anticipated. Guinea pigs, when frightened or uncomfortable, default to a freeze response. It is a survival mechanism. When a guinea pig feels threatened, it does not fight and it does not run. It freezes. It becomes completely motionless, sometimes for hours at a time. The costumed guinea pigs, placed in unfamiliar environments and dressed in tiny outfits that they presumably did not enjoy wearing, did exactly what their biology told them to do. They froze. They sat, motionless, staring at the camera with their small, round eyes, refusing to provide the kind of dynamic, destructive footage that the scenes required. The production team spent enormous amounts of time trying to coax usable footage from animals whose primary survival instinct was to remain perfectly still. It is a small detail, a footnote in the production history of a show with far more dramatic stories to tell, but it captures something essential about the way South Park breaks. The show's ambitions, even its most ridiculous ambitions, are genuine. The commitment to the bit, as comedians say, is total. Parker and Stone did not want to approximate the effect of guinea pig monsters. They wanted guinea pig monsters, and reality, as it so often does with South Park, refused to cooperate. The guinea pigs did not care about the production schedule. They did not care about the air date. They did not care about the creative vision, or the satirical target, or the elaborate special effects being built around their performance. They cared about surviving, and surviving, for a guinea pig, means holding very, very still. Before this goes any further, a quick subscribe would be wonderful. It helps more than you might think. There is also the curious case of the episode that South Park produced about a topic it had already settled, only to discover that its own position had shifted without anyone noticing. The episode with apologies to Jesse Jackson, the season 11 premiere, aired on March 7th, 2007, and it tackled the use of racial slurs with a directness that surprised even longtime fans. The episode opens with Randy Marsh appearing on Wheel of Fortune, where the puzzle solution is obviously a common phrase. Randy, faced with the blank letters, says the N-word on national television. The fallout is immediate and devastating. Randy becomes a pariah. He is ostracized, threatened, and publicly humiliated. The episode proceeds to examine the word itself, its power, its history, and the impossibility of any white person fully understanding the experience of having that word directed at them. What makes the episode relevant to a discussion of broken episodes is not its quality, which is high, or its reception, which was overwhelmingly positive. The NAACP praised it as a good example of educating the public on the power of hate words. The opening scene with Randy on Wheel of Fortune has been cited by Parker as one of his favorite things the show has ever done. What makes it relevant is the creative process that produced it. Parker and Stone had wanted to make an episode about the word for years. They knew the opening scene. They knew Randy would say it, but they could not figure out what came after. The scene was so strong, so perfectly constructed, that everything that followed felt inadequate by comparison. The episode languished in conceptual purgatory, a brilliant opening attached to nothing, until the Michael Richards controversy of November 2006 provided the missing context. Richards, the actor best known for playing Kramer on Seinfeld, had screamed the slur repeatedly at hecklers during a stand-up performance, and the resulting public outcry gave Parker and Stone the cultural framework they needed to build the rest of the episode. This is the opposite of the Crab People problem, where South Park is Gay had a strong premise that collapsed at the ending. With apologies to Jesse Jackson had a strong opening that could not find a middle or a conclusion until reality itself provided one. Both episodes were shaped, fundamentally, by the same constraint. The 6-day production cycle does not allow time for creative problems to resolve themselves organically. In a normal production environment, a writer who has a brilliant opening scene but no second act can set the script aside and return to it later with fresh eyes and new ideas. In South Park's production environment, the script cannot be set aside. It has to air this week, or it does not air at all. The result is that some episodes are driven to completion by the clock rather than by the creative process, and the quality of the finished product depends, to a degree that would make most artists uncomfortable, on whether the right external stimulus happens to arrive at the right moment. The story of Britney's new look deserves a moment here, because it represents a specific and unusual kind of brokenness. The episode aired on March 19th, 2008, the second episode of season 12. It was produced during a period of extraordinary media focus on Britney Spears, who had, in the preceding months, shaved her head, been placed under involuntary psychiatric hold, and become the subject of a level of paparazzi scrutiny that bordered on persecution. The media coverage was relentless and deeply invasive, treating Spears' obvious mental health crisis as entertainment rather than tragedy. The episode takes a dark approach to this material. In the episode, Spears attempts suicide with a shotgun, but survives, losing most of her head in the process. The remaining half head of Britney Spears then becomes the subject of even more intense media attention, with the public treating her mutilated appearance as content to be consumed. The boys initially participate in the exploitation before gradually realizing that what they are witnessing is not entertainment but sacrifice, a ritualistic destruction of a human being conducted by a society that feeds on celebrity suffering. The episode is, in intention, a defense of Spears. It is an attack on the media and the public that consumed her breakdown as though it were a spectator sport. The satire is aimed not at Spears, but at the culture that was destroying her. But the execution is so dark, so graphic, and so uncomfortable that the distinction between attacking Spears and defending her became blurred for many viewers. Spears herself was reportedly not fond of the episode, even though its point was fundamentally sympathetic to her. The episode carries a 7.1 on IMDb, which is low for South Park, and it represents a specific kind of brokenness. An episode that intended to say one thing, but was heard saying another. An episode whose satirical target was clear to its creators, but unclear to its audience. An episode that was trying to be compassionate in a medium that is not built for compassion. There is another dimension to Britney's new look that connects it to the broader pattern of South Park's broken episodes, and it has to do with the relationship between speed and sensitivity. The 6-day production cycle is designed for topicality. It is designed to respond to the news of the week with the speed and sharpness that no other animated show can match. But topicality and sensitivity are not always compatible. A cultural moment that is ripe for satire on Monday might feel very different by Wednesday, when the episode airs. The context might have shifted. New information might have emerged. The public mood might have changed in ways that make the episode's approach feel tone-deaf or cruel or simply misguided. And because the 6-day cycle does not allow for revision after the fact, there is no mechanism for adjusting the episode's message once it has been produced. The tape goes to the uplink facility. The episode airs, and whatever it says permanently. Britney's new look is a case where the intention was right, but the execution was too dark for the medium to convey the nuance. The episode wanted to condemn the media's treatment of Spears, but it condemned that treatment by depicting even worse treatment, and the line between satirizing cruelty and perpetuating it became too thin for many viewers to discern. This problem recurs throughout South Park's history. This tension between intent and perception, between what an episode means and what it appears to mean. The show's defenders will argue that the intent matters, that understanding the satirical target requires engagement with the text rather than a surface-level reaction. The show's critics will argue that intent is irrelevant if the effect is indistinguishable from the thing being criticized. Both positions have merit, and the 6-day production cycle, by eliminating the possibility of nuanced revision, guarantees that this tension will never be resolved. Every episode is what it is. There is no rewrite. There is no second take. There is no opportunity to say, this scene reads as cruel rather than critical. Perhaps the framing should be adjusted. The framing is the framing, and the audience will interpret it however they choose. The show also produced an episode in 2009 that tackled gender double standards with similarly mixed results. Eat, Pray, Queef, the 4th episode of season 13, aired on April 1st, 2009. The premise was simple and deliberately confrontational. When a new show called The Queef Sisters debuts on the network that carries Terrence and Phillip, the male characters of South Park are outraged by its humor, which is identical to Terrence and Phillip's humor except that it involves queefing rather than farting. The episode forces the male characters, and by extension the male audience, to confront a double standard. If fart jokes are funny when men do them, why are the equivalent jokes disgusting when women do them? The episode was seen by more than 3 million households in its original airing, making it the most watched Comedy Central production of that week. Critical reception was split. Some praised the satirical intent. Others argued that the extended sequences of queef humor, while making a valid point about double standards, were themselves so unpleasant that they undermined the message. The episode illustrated a recurring challenge for South Park. In order to demonstrate that a double standard exists, the show had to inhabit that double standard, had to make the audience experience the discomfort of the thing it was criticizing. And for some viewers, the experience was so unpleasant that they never arrived at the point. There is also the matter of With Apologies to Jesse Jackson, and how its creative process illuminates the opposite problem from the Crab People situation. Where South Park is Gay had a strong premise that collapsed at the ending. With Apologies to Jesse Jackson, the season 11 premiere that aired on March 7th, 2007, had a brilliant opening that could not find a middle or a conclusion until reality itself provided one. Parker and Stone had wanted to make an episode about the N-word for years. They knew the opening scene. Randy Marsh on Wheel of Fortune, the answer obviously being a common phrase, and Randy saying the word on national television. Parker has cited that scene as one of his favorite things the show has ever done, but for years, they could not figure out what came after. The scene was so strong, so perfectly constructed, that everything that followed felt inadequate. The episode languished in conceptual limbo, a brilliant opening attached to nothing, until the Michael Richards controversy of November 2006 provided the missing context. Richards, the actor best known for playing Kramer on Seinfeld, had screamed the slur repeatedly at hecklers during a stand-up performance, and the resulting public outcry gave Parker and Stone the cultural framework they needed to build the rest of the episode. The episode ultimately earned praise from the NAACP, who called it a good example of educating the public on the power of hate words. But its production history reveals something important about South Park's creative process. Some of the show's best ideas cannot be produced on the 6-day cycle. They require a specific cultural moment, a specific external trigger, a specific alignment of reality and fiction that cannot be manufactured or predicted. The 6-day cycle does not allow time for creative problems to resolve themselves organically. In a normal production environment, a writer who has a brilliant opening scene but no second act can set the script aside and return to it later with fresh eyes and new ideas. In South Park's production environment, an episode either airs this week or it does not air at all. Some ideas wait for years in Parker's mind, waiting for reality to provide the piece they are missing. And some ideas never find that piece, and they remain unproduced. Fragments of potential brilliance that the 6-day cycle could not accommodate. And then there is the episode from 2018 that took on school shootings with a directness that made many viewers profoundly uncomfortable. Dead Kids, the season 22 premiere, aired on September 26, 2018. The episode's central conceit is terrifyingly simple. School shootings are happening at South Park Elementary on a regular basis, and nobody cares. The teachers continue teaching through the gunfire. The students continue studying. The SWAT teams that storm the classroom are treated as minor inconveniences, like fire drills or assemblies. The only person who seems disturbed by the carnage is Sharon Marsh, Stan's mother, and her distress is dismissed by her husband Randy as a symptom of menstruation or menopause. The episode is a satire of American desensitization to gun violence, and it is effective in the way that the best South Park episodes are effective, which is to say, it takes a real and horrifying phenomenon and exaggerates it just enough to make the audience see its own complicity. But the execution was uneven. Critics noted that reducing Sharon's legitimate horror to a hormonal joke, while clearly intended as satire of how women's concerns are dismissed, also functioned as an actual dismissal of women's concerns. The episode was trying to do two things simultaneously: satirize gun violence, desensitization, and satirize the dismissal of female emotion, and neither target received the depth of treatment it deserved. The 6-day cycle, once again, did not leave enough room for the episode to fully develop the ideas it was reaching for. The result was an episode that made its point, but did not quite stick the landing, that provoked the conversation it wanted to provoke, but also provoked criticism it did not intend. And this brings us, finally, to the present, or something close to it. South Park has now been on the air for 28 seasons. 338 episodes, plus streaming specials, plus a feature film, plus a Broadway musical. It has survived controversies that would have destroyed lesser shows. It has weathered censorship battles and death threats and international bans and the loss of a principal cast member and the departure and tragic death of a beloved voice actor and the failure of a season-long narrative experiment and a global global pandemic and the weekly emotional breakdown of its creator. It has produced episodes that its creators openly despise, episodes that have been erased from official existence, and episodes that were nearly prevented from airing by the combined efforts of religious organizations, foreign governments, and the show's own network. It has apologized to Al Gore. It has been banned from China. It has made its own creator beg on a weekly basis for the show not to air. There is something worth saying about the MPAA battle over the South Park movie that has not been fully explored here, because it represents perhaps the purest distillation of the show's adversarial relationship with institutional authority. In 1999, when Parker and Stone submitted South Park, bigger, longer, and uncut for its rating, the MPAA returned it with an NC-17 designation. This was not a surprise. The film contains extensive profanity, sexual content, and graphic violence, all rendered in the show's distinctive animation style. What was surprising was the process that followed. Parker and Stone made adjustments and resubmitted. NC-17. They made more adjustments and resubmitted. NC-17. They resubmitted again. NC-17. At least 6 times, the film was submitted and rejected. Each time, Parker and Stone made changes that were, by their own account, marginal at best. They were not fundamentally altering the film. They were trimming a word here, shortening a scene there, making the kind of superficial modifications that might satisfy a bureaucratic process without actually changing the thing being evaluated. And the MPAA, apparently aware that the changes were cosmetic, but unable to articulate exactly what needed to change, kept returning the film with the same rating. The film finally received an R rating just 2 weeks before its theatrical release, a timeline that would have been catastrophic for a live-action film, but that South Park's production team, accustomed to finishing things at the last possible moment, took in stride. The MPAA battle produced one lasting consequence that perfectly captures the show's approach to authority. When the MPAA rejected the film's original title, South Park: All Hell Breaks Loose, because it contained the word hell, Parker and Stone replaced it with South Park: Bigger, Longer, and Uncut. The new title is, transparently, a reference to the male anatomy. The MPAA approved it. The story became one of the defining anecdotes in the show's history, a perfect illustration of Parker and Stone's ability to outwit the institutional forces arrayed against them by being, in some fundamental way, smarter and more nimble than the institutions trying to control them. Matt Stone later called the MPAA a bumbling, irresponsible organization. The experience informed the show's ongoing skepticism of authority in all its forms, from government to religion to corporate governance. When you have watched a bureaucracy spend months failing to articulate what it finds objectionable about your work, it becomes difficult to take bureaucracies seriously. And South Park has never taken bureaucracies seriously. That lack of seriousness, that refusal to defer to institutional authority, is both the source of the show's freedom and the source of many of its most broken episodes. And it keeps going. Every Thursday morning, Trey Parker walks into the South Park studios and starts the process again. He does not know what the episode will be about. He does not know if it will work. He does not know if the ending will be Crab People or an Emmy. He knows, with the certainty of 3 decades of experience, that by Tuesday night, he will be convinced that it will not work, that this is the one that ends everything, that the legacy is about to be destroyed. And he knows that Matt Stone and Ann Garifano will talk him down, as they have talked him down hundreds of times before. And he knows that the episode will air, ready or not, finished or not, good or not. And he knows that the following Thursday, the whole thing will start over. Fresh blank page, fresh terror, fresh impossible deadline. The broken episodes of South Park are not aberrations. They are not failures of an otherwise perfect system. They are the inevitable product of a creative process that was designed, from its very first day, to operate at the edge of failure. The show's greatest episodes and its worst episodes are made in the same room, by the same people, under the same impossible deadline, with the same tools and the same anxieties and the same stubborn refusal to slow down or play it safe or give themselves even one extra day to get it right. The difference between Make Love, Not Warcraft, and A Million Little Fibers is not a difference in talent or effort or ambition. It is a difference in luck, in timing, in whether the Crab People idea turns out to be genius or disaster, in whether the guinea pigs decide to move or to freeze, in whether the President of the United States turns out to be the person everyone expected. South Park breaks because it was built about to break. That is not a flaw. That is the design. The show was constructed, deliberately and knowingly, to operate without the safeguards that protect most television from its own worst impulses. No buffer, no safety net, no time for second thoughts. And the result is a show that has produced some of the most brilliant and some of the most terrible episodes in the history of animated television. Sometimes in the same season, sometimes in the same month, and once, in the case of season 10, in nearly the same breath. The remarkable thing, the thing that keeps the show running, after 338 episodes and counting, after nearly 3 decades and billions of dollars in contracts and countless sleepless Tuesday nights, is that the breaking is almost always more interesting than the version that works perfectly. The broken episodes are the ones that reveal the machinery. They are the ones that show you what happens when a creative process that runs on anxiety and deadlines and sheer stubborn refusal to slow down encounters something it cannot control. They are messy and imperfect and sometimes genuinely bad. And they are, in their own strange way, the truest expression of what South Park has always been. A show made in 6 days, held together with digital glue and exhaustion, and the faint hope that this time, maybe, the whole thing will not fall apart. It always almost falls apart. That is the point. That has always been the point. And maybe that is why the broken episodes, for all their failures, are so important. Not because they are good television. Some of them are. Some of them are not. But because they are evidence that the show is alive. A show that never breaks is a show that never risks. A show that never produces a Jack of a Sores or a Million Little Fibers is a show that has calculated exactly how much risk it can tolerate and never exceeds that threshold. South Park does not calculate. South Park guesses. South Park throws ideas at the wall and sees what sticks. And sometimes what sticks is crab people. And sometimes what sticks is an Emmy. And sometimes what sticks is a death threat from an extremist organization. The range is the point. The unpredictability is the point. The feeling, when you sit down to watch a new episode of South Park, that you genuinely do not know what is coming. That the show might deliver one of the funniest 22 minutes of television you have ever seen, or one of the most baffling. That feeling is only possible because the show has earned it through decades of being equally capable of both. Think about what it means to produce 338 episodes of anything. 338 times, a blank page was filled. 338 times, a story was told, from beginning to middle to end. 338 times, the machine was turned on, the pipeline was activated, the departments were mobilized, and a finished product was delivered to a satellite uplink facility with hours to spare. Some of those 338 episodes are among the greatest achievements in the history of American animation. Some of them are forgettable. Some of them are actively bad. And 5 of them no longer officially exist. But all of them were made. All of them were completed. All of them survived the 6-day gauntlet. Every single one. Even the ones that their creator begged the network not to air. Even the ones that provoked international incidents. Even the ones that were rewritten overnight because the President of the United States was not the person everyone expected. That consistency of output, regardless of quality, regardless of circumstance, regardless of the personal and professional crises erupting around the production, is itself a kind of miracle. Or if not a miracle, then at least an extraordinary act of endurance. Trey Parker has been walking into the same studio every Thursday morning for nearly 30 years. He has been sitting down at the same kind of desk, opening the same kind of blank document, and beginning the same impossible process 338 times. And every time, by his own account, he has been convinced that this is the time it will not work. This is the time the well has run dry. This is the time the show ends. And every time, it has not been. Not yet. Not so far. So lie back. Let the light from the screen wash over you. Let the stories of broken episodes and frantic rewrites and death threats and crab people and frozen guinea pigs and overnight election scrambles settle into something like background noise. Something soft and distant. Something that does not need to be solved or understood, just experienced. South Park has been breaking for 28 years. It will probably break again next week, and the week after that, and the week after that. And every time, Trey Parker will be convinced that this is the end. And every time, it will not be. And that, more than any individual episode, more than when any individual joke or controversy or production disaster is the story of South Park. A show that has been on the verge of falling apart for its entire existence and has somehow never quite managed to do so. 338 episodes and counting, 6 days at a time, breaking and mending and breaking again, forever, or at least until the contract runs out. Sleep well. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next.